What if I told you that tonight is not an ordinary night, and that sleep, real sleep, the kind that receives you the way water receives a stone, the kind that closes over you softly and completely without a single ripple of resistance, is not an escape from your life, but an appointment with the living God? Not a metaphor tonight, not a pretty way of speaking, an appointment, written down somewhere older than your worry, kept the way the earth keeps its own turning, without your permission, without your effort, without you lifting one single finger to make it happen. The tide does not consult the shore before it comes in. It simply comes, because coming in is its nature. The moon does not negotiate with the tide either, and the tide does not resent the moon for pulling it where it must go. There is no struggle anywhere in that whole quiet arrangement, only an ancient, wordless agreement being kept, night after night, without fail. Tonight, rest is going to come to you in exactly that same way, unearned, unbargained for, simply because it is rest's nature to come to the ones who finally stop bracing against it. You have been taught, somewhere along the long, tired road that brought you here, that rest must be earned before it is given, that supply must be chased down like something skittish and unwilling, that the good things of this world are handed only to the ones who claw hardest and longest for them. You have carried that teaching in your chest like a stone sewn into the lining of a coat, so long now that you have almost forgotten it can be removed at all. And so you lie down each night, still gripping something invisible in your two closed hands, still running the same quiet arithmetic of your lack behind eyes that refuse to fully close, still keeping watch over a house that was never actually left unguarded, patrolling hallways no thief has ever once walked down. Tonight, we are going to set all of that down, slowly, the way you might finally set down a bag you had forgotten you were even carrying. Not by force. Never by force. Because force was never the way in the first place. Not once. Not in any of the old stories. Not in any of the true ones. We set it down the way a hand slowly opens when it finally understands there was never really anything in it to hold on to begin with. When the fingers simply forget, one by one, what they thought they were protecting. Florence Scovel Shinn spent her whole life teaching a single, luminous truth, turning it over again and again in different lights so that everyone who heard her might eventually catch it from some angle. The way you might turn a stone in your palm to find the one facet that finally catches the sun, that the spoken word is a wand, that whatever you decree, believing it fully, moves quietly through an unseen substance that surrounds you always, and slowly, faithfully, without hurry, takes visible shape in your world. And long before her, centuries before her, older than any of us gathered here tonight, the scriptures had already said the very same thing in their own ancient language, in the hush of a desert night not unlike this one. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. God spoke, simply spoke, and it was so. No hesitation between the speaking and the becoming, no delay, no waiting room, no long line of applicants ahead of the light. Tonight those two rivers, the ancient one and the modern one, become a single river, wide and slow and gold, moving the way rivers move when they have nowhere urgent to be, and you are simply going to lie down in it and let it carry you wherever it already knows you need to go, verse answering decree, decree answering verse, all night long, until you can no longer tell exactly where the old promise ends and your own quiet yes quietly begins. Before we go any further into the dark together, would you do one small thing for me? Just tap the like button, wherever your thumb already happens to be resting, heavy now against the phone, half willing, half already surrendering to sleep. It costs you nothing at all, not 1 ounce of the peace you came here for, and it tells me, in its own small, quiet way, that tonight this found the right soul at the right hour, in the right room, on the right pillow. And if you have even a moment left before your eyes grow too heavy to keep open, tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I love knowing how far this voice actually travels while you sleep, how it slips quietly under doors and across time zones like a tide of its own. Someone waking to read it tomorrow morning in London, kettle just starting to hum, steam curling up into grey early light. Someone else in Manila, in Lagos, in a small quiet house somewhere in Ohio, with the porch light still burning against the dark, for no one in particular. We are, in this very moment, one long unbroken line of tired people, all learning, together, slowly, how to rest inside the same unfailing supply. Stay with me all the way to the very end tonight, because the final movement carries a single phrase, just one, the one this entire journey has been quietly, patiently building toward from its very first word, laid down like a single stone at a time, across a whole riverbed. And once that phrase settles all the way down into you, all the way to the floor of you, I do not think lack will ever again sound quite as convincing as it once did. Not on the loneliest night, not in the smallest hour. Let your body find its own place now. Let it settle the way sand settles once the wave has finally pulled back out to sea, grain by grain finding its own low, quiet rest. You do not have to hold any of it up anymore. Not your shoulders, not your jaw, not the quiet weight behind your eyes that has been there so long you stopped noticing it was ever a weight at all. Let it all be received. There is a moment, arriving every single night of every single life, when the body simply stops arguing with the day it has just lived through. You know this moment intimately, even if you have never once named it, never once watched it arrive the way you are about to watch it arrive tonight. It is arriving now, somewhere low behind your ribs, a loosening you did not order, did not schedule, cannot rush along no matter how you try, the way you cannot rush a bruise into healing faster, by staring at it. Feel it beginning at the very edges of you first, the fingertips, the soft place behind the knees, the small hollow at the base of your throat, and moving slowly inward, the way warmth moves through cold water, unhurried, patient, spreading in soft rings outward from some center you cannot quite locate. The psalmist understood this, long before there were sleep studies or soft blankets, or any of the modern language we use for tiredness, back when sleep itself was simply understood as a mercy, plain and unearned. And he wrote it so plainly, it almost startles you the first time you really hear it, the way a very simple sentence sometimes startles you more than a complicated one ever could. As the psalmist wrote, "He giveth his beloved sleep," not sells it to the highest bidder, not rations it out carefully to the ones who have proven themselves worthy that day, keeping careful ledgers of who deserves how much rest, gives it, freely, the way a gift is dropped, without condition, into hands that have finally stopped clenching around nothing at all. This is not the end of your usefulness for the day, though some old voice in you may still whisper that it is, still insist that value must be produced every waking hour or forfeited entirely. This is the beginning of an entirely different kind of work, the kind done completely without your effort or your supervision, the kind that continues quietly behind a curtain you were never meant to peek behind, the kind Florence Scovel Shinn described so often when she taught that the very moment you release a thing fully into the unseen, it is already, quietly, being arranged on your behalf. Arranged the way a table is set in a room you have not yet entered, the linens already smoothed, the light already softened just so, waiting patiently for you to simply walk in and sit down. She had a phrase for that release, and she used it so simply, so often, that it almost sounds too easy to be entirely true, and yet the easy ones are so often the truest, the ones that slip past the mind's suspicion, precisely because they ask nothing hard of you at all. Let go and let God. Let go and let God. Say it inwardly now, without any effort at all. The way you would finally let a long-held breath leave your chest on its own timing. Not pushed out, but simply allowed to go. Feel your jaw unclench a little further as you do. Feel the hinge of it soften like something long rusted finally given a little oil. Feel the small muscles around your eyes soften, releasing a tension you did not even realize you had been carrying since morning, since long before this morning even, since some morning you can no longer quite remember the beginning of. You are not solving anything tonight, not one single thing. You are being solved. Now, I want to explore what actually happens in that quiet gap between your letting go and God's taking hold, because that gap, small as it feels, is far less empty than it has ever felt to you before. In the very first pages of everything that has ever existed, long before there was a world for anything to stand on, before there was even a shore for a tide to visit, there was only a voice moving quietly over darkness, unhurried, patient, sure of itself in a way nothing since has ever quite managed to be. No hesitation in that voice, no throat clearing before the speaking, no rehearsal, no second draft, and the voice spoke, simply spoke, into an emptiness that had never once been anything else, and what it spoke became, instantly, completely, without struggle, without delay, without so much as a pause for the universe to consider whether it agreed. As it is written in Genesis, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Not eventually, after enough striving, or enough waiting, or enough proving of worthiness. The word went out into the dark, and the thing itself appeared, because the word and the substance it moved through were never truly separate to begin with. They never have been, not for one single instant since. Florence Scovel Shinn built the whole of her teaching around this single, radiant thread, returning to it the way a compass needle always returns to north, no matter how far it is turned away, that the spoken word, said with real conviction, quiet and unwavering, is a wand that touches the unseen substance around you and shapes it into something visible. Not magic in any cheap or theatrical sense, no sleight of hand, no trick of smoke or mirror. Inheritance, the plain birthright of a being made, as it is written, in the very image of a speaking God, carrying inside itself some small, faithful echo of that same first creative voice. Every fearful word you have ever whispered to yourself in the dark has been doing this same quiet work too, shaping something, weaving some small thread into the fabric of your days, without your even noticing the loom, which is precisely why tonight, together, we choose the words with such tenderness, such deliberate slowness, such care, as though we were laying each one down like a coin on a scale we actually trust. This or something better now manifests for me. This or something better now manifests for me. Feel how little urgency actually lives inside that sentence, how spacious it is, how unhurried, how it asks nothing of you but a kind of open-handed patience. No pushing against a closed door, no shoulder set against wood that was never going to move that way, no deadline pressed up against it like a hand on glass, fogging the view with its own anxious breath. Just a door, held gently, patiently open, so that grace might choose its own good shape and its own good timing, in its own good hour, without your supervision. Now, I want to explore what it truly means to trust the word, even when nothing visible has shifted yet. Because that particular kind of waiting has its own quiet, sacred architecture, built without a single visible brick, and yet somehow standing. There is an old, familiar fear that lives quietly underneath so many sleepless nights, tucked into the mattress itself, it sometimes seems, folded into the very sheets, the fear that there simply is not enough to go around, not enough time, not enough money, not enough love left over, specifically, for you, as though love itself were a finite pie, already carved up and handed out to everyone who arrived at the table before you did. Paul, writing to a small struggling church in Philippi, people who had genuinely, actually known real lack, real hunger, real uncertainty about where the next meal or the next kindness might come from, wrote something that was not offered as a hopeful wish, but delivered as a flat, calm statement of fact, the way you might state the color of the sky. As Paul wrote, "My God shall supply all your need, according to his riches in glory, by Christ Jesus." Not according to your bank balance on a given Tuesday, not measured out against whatever number happens to sit in some ledger tonight, not according to what is currently visible in your hand, small and empty as that hand might feel right now, according to his riches. Let that distinction rest in you for a moment, wide and unhurried, the way you might let a single note of music simply hang in a large room before it fades. Florence Scovel Shinn taught this exact same truth in her own gentle language, again and again, to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear it, patient as a teacher with a slow and beloved student, that the actual source of your good was never the job, never the person, never any single circumstance you could point a finger toward, but God moving quietly through all of it at once, behind every one of it, beneath every one of it, the way water moves beneath the surface of a frozen pond, even when the ice above looks perfectly still and perfectly solid. And once you truly saw the source clearly, really saw it, you stopped mistaking any one channel for the supply itself. Channels can close, one after another, the way rivers sometimes shift their beds and leave old channels dry and forgotten. They always have, throughout every human life, throughout every generation that has ever worried in the dark. The source, though, cannot. It has never once run dry, not in the entire history of anyone who ever truly leaned on it. God is my unfailing supply. God is my unfailing supply. Let that sentence settle slowly into the exact place where your worry usually likes to live, crowding it gently, patiently out, the way the first light of morning crowds out even the most vivid dream without ever once raising its voice, without ever once announcing its own arrival. Now, I want to explore what happens the moment you finally stop confusing one single closed door with the closing of all supply everywhere, because that particular confusion has cost so very many peaceful nights, yours among them, more of them than you have probably ever counted. Somewhere in you tonight, there is a weight you have been carrying for so long you have quietly mistaken it for part of your own body, part of your own shape, something you were simply born already holding, the way some people are born with a particular color of eyes. A worry about someone you love more than you know how to say, more than the words you have for it. A regret that replays itself in the same worn grooves, over and over, late at night especially, when the mind has nothing else left to occupy it, and reaches, out of old habit, for the same familiar ache. A fear dressed up carefully as responsibility, wearing its clothes so well you no longer recognize it underneath, no longer remember there was ever a face beneath that particular mask at all. The psalmist knew this exact weight, intimately, personally, carried it himself across long nights, not unlike this one, and he did not tell you to manage it more efficiently, or organize it into neater categories, or simply carry it with better posture, so it would hurt your back a little less. As the psalmist wrote, "Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee." Cast it, not set it down carefully where you can still see it, and pick it back up later, out of old habit. Cast it, the way you would finally throw something into the sea that you never should have picked up from the shore in the first place, watching it sink and disappear beneath water, too deep and too dark, for it to ever be fished back out again. Florence Scovel Shinn used to say, often, to person after person who came to her heavy with trouble, weary in the particular way that only long carrying produces, that most people spend their whole lives carrying burdens God was never even once asked to lift, simply because somewhere along the way they forgot the burden could be handed over at all, forgot there was ever anyone standing there with open hands, waiting. She gave that handing over its own simple sentence, one she returned to constantly, for herself just as much as for everyone who sat across from her in whatever quiet room she happened to be teaching in that day. I cast this burden on the Christ within, and I go free. I cast this burden on the Christ within, and I go free. Feel your shoulders believe it, before your mind ever fully catches up, the way the body so often understands grace, long before the thinking mind agrees to sign off on it. That is so often how grace actually arrives, quietly, through the body first, through some small unclenching in the muscles of the back or the neck, long before the thinking mind agrees to come along and confirm what has already, quietly, happened. Now, I want to explore what freedom itself actually feels like once that particular weight is finally, truly gone, because it is so much quieter than you might expect it to be, so much less like triumph, and so much more like simply breathing. There is a kind of asking that comes entirely from lack, tight and desperate and grasping at the edges, fingers already curled around a disappointment before the answer has even arrived. And there is another kind of asking entirely, a completely different frequency, open-palmed and unhurried, the kind Jesus described so plainly to people who had already half convinced themselves the door was locked forever, permanently, with no key anywhere to be found and no locksmith willing to come. As Jesus said, "Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you." Notice how certain that promise actually is, how unqualified, how free of hedging or fine print. Not ask, and perhaps it will be considered by some distant committee at some later date. Ask, and it shall be given, plainly, simply, the way a gift is given to someone already known and already loved. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that once you truly understand your own real identity, you are not some beggar knocking timidly and apologetically at a stranger's locked door in the rain, hat in hand, rehearsing an apology before you have even been let in. You are recognized there already. You are in fact expected, the way a long-awaited guest is expected, the table already set, the lamp already lit in the window against the dark. She described the person aligned with this deeper truth as something almost gravitational in nature, quietly, effortlessly drawing its good toward itself, the way certain metals simply cannot help but attract exactly what already belongs to them by their very nature, without strain, without chase, without a single wasted motion. I am an irresistible magnet for all that belongs to me by divine right. I am an irresistible magnet for all that belongs to me by divine right. Not what you will have to fight for, tooth and nail, against some imagined competition. Not what you will have to prove yourself worthy of first, through some endless unspoken trial. What already belongs to you. What was, in fact, already yours before you ever even thought to ask for it. Set aside quietly, with your name already written on it. Now, I want to explore what happens in that quiet space between the knock and the opening, because that particular space is exactly where so many people, tired and impatient, give up just a little too soon, turning away just before the hinge finally, silently begins to move. Here is something almost too tender to say out loud, and yet Isaiah said it plainly, centuries ago, in a voice carried across a distance of time so vast it should have worn the word smooth by now, on behalf of a God who apparently does not even wait for the whole request to finish forming before responding to it. As it is written in Isaiah, "Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear." Think for just a moment, slowly, about what that means for you tonight, specifically, in this exact room, on this exact pillow, beneath this exact quiet dark. Somewhere in you there is a need you have not even fully named yet, still forming its shape in the quiet dark like breath on cold glass. still gathering itself into words you have not yet spoken even to yourself. And it is already, even now, being met, already being answered before the sentence of your asking has even finished forming in you. This is simply not how human giving usually works. This is not the economy you learned as a child, watching how the visible world hands things out. And Florence Scovel Shinn was always careful to draw that exact distinction, again and again, patiently, gently, that God's economy runs on an entirely different clock than man's economy does. Unhurried, always somehow already ahead of you, already arranged long before you thought to ask, the way a good parent has already thought of the thing the child has not yet realized it needs. She often placed her own will gently beneath that larger one, not in any kind of defeat, not in resignation, but in a deep and settled trust, the kind that no longer needs to check the math itself. God's will be done, not mine own. God's will be done, not mine own. There is no smallness at all in that particular surrender, no diminishment, no shrinking. There is relief in it instead, the deep relief of no longer having to be the one who decides absolutely everything, every hour, every day, every small worried calculation. Now, I want to explore what it means to trust a will wiser than your own without needing to fully understand it first, because understanding, it turns out, was never actually the requirement, was never even the point. Somewhere very close to right now, your mind is probably still moving a little, still rehearsing tomorrow's small conversations, still quietly auditing yesterday's mistakes one more time, turning them over like coins whose value it can never quite settle. Let it. It will tire before too long, the way a child eventually tires of running in circles around the same small yard. And when it does finally tire, there is a verse waiting patiently for it, one of the shortest and yet somehow heaviest verses in all of Scripture, small enough to fit inside a single breath, and vast enough to hold an entire lifetime. As the psalmist wrote, "Be still, and know that I am God." Not be still and figure everything out first. Not be still until every loose end is finally tied. Be still and know. The knowing arrives from inside the stillness itself, never before it, never as a reward for solving anything at all. Florence Scovel Shinn returned to this exact verse again and again in her own writing, insisting that most of what people call their problems are simply the noise of a mind that has not yet gone quiet enough to hear the answer that is already being given, patiently, underneath all that noise, the way a radio station is already playing, even before you have found the right frequency to receive it. She taught that the very same instruction that once calmed a storm on open water, spoken to wind and wave by a voice that expected to be obeyed, could calm an entire life, an entire history of small internal storms, and she framed her own quieting the same simple way, over and over, whenever fear rose up in her uninvited. Let go and let God. Let go and let God. Feel the stillness now, not as some kind of absence, some empty room with the lights turned off, but as a kind of listening, warm and full and alive, attentive in a way silence rarely gets credit for being. Now, I want to explore what the shepherd actually does with a soul that has finally stopped wandering long enough to be led somewhere good, because that is exactly where the next verse gently takes us, one slow step at a time. There may be no words in the whole of Scripture more worn smooth by human need, by generations of tired hands turning them over and over like a stone in a pocket, worn soft by centuries of exactly this kind of night, and yet they have never once lost their power, because the need they answer never once actually goes away, never once becomes outdated. As the psalmist wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." Let those particular words move over you now, the slow way water moves over stone, patient beyond measure, wearing away only the sharp edges and leaving everything else exactly as it should be, exactly as it was always meant to be shaped. Florence Scovel Shinn believed, deeply and without reservation, that love, real love, actually moving through a person, actively, not just felt but expressed, could not help but leave everyone it touched better off, more prospered, never depleted, never diminished by the giving, the way a candle loses nothing of its own flame by lighting another candle beside it. She did not see generosity and abundance as two opposing forces pulling against each other, tugging in different directions like a rope in a contest. She saw them, instead, as the very same current, flowing outward freely, and somehow, impossibly, returning fuller than it left, the way a river gives itself entirely to the sea and is somehow never actually diminished by the giving. Divine love, through me, blesses and prospers all men. Divine love, through me, blesses and prospers all men. You are not being asked, tonight or ever, to give away what you do not have, to pour from a jar you fear is already nearly empty. You are simply being asked to let love move through you, the way light moves through a window, without the window losing anything of itself, and to trust its own quiet arithmetic completely. Now, I want to explore what it truly means to want nothing, not because you have secured everything, not because every door is bolted against every possible loss, but because the source itself is never, ever in question. There is a kind of striving that looks, from a distance, almost like devotion, almost like faithfulness, but is actually just fear, wearing a very convincing religious coat, the endless chasing after more and more things, the quiet belief that if you could just secure enough of the visible world, gather enough of it into your own two hands, you would finally feel safe, finally be able to exhale. Jesus addressed this directly, and with such gentleness, such patience, to people every bit as anxious as anyone lying awake tonight, people worrying about the very same ordinary things you worry about. As Jesus said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." Added, not wrestled out of the world through struggle and force, not pried loose with clenched hands and gritted teeth. Added, the quiet, effortless way a shadow simply follows a body without ever once being chased down, without the body having to look back over its shoulder to make sure the shadow is still coming. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that once your attention rests first on the unseen kingdom, settling there the way a bird finally settles on a branch after a long flight, the visible world around you simply begins to rearrange itself around that focus, without your constant management, without your endless checking and rechecking of every small detail. She kept returning to the very same anchor point whenever anyone asked her how to finally stop striving so hard, how to finally set down the exhausting work of trying to force the world into shape. God is my unfailing supply. God is my unfailing supply. Let your seeking soften now into something much closer to simply resting your attention exactly where it already belongs, the way a compass needle rests, without struggle, pointing where it was always going to point. Now I want to explore what actually gets added when the seeking finally stops leading the way and starts, instead, quietly following. If any of this is resonating with you tonight, if something in your chest has loosened even slightly since we first began this journey together, some small knot finally starting to soften, a simple like, tells me this found exactly the right person tonight, and it helps this quiet corner of the internet find the next tired soul who needs precisely this, precisely tonight, precisely this particular kind of quiet. No pressure at all in it, none whatsoever. Just a small, quiet act of the very same generosity we have been speaking of together all along. Love simply moving a little further outward through you before you finally sleep. There is a verse the psalmist wrote, almost like a private confession, whispered more than declared. One Florence Scovel Shinn quoted often because it names the actual mechanism of receiving so plainly, not the asking so much as the wanting itself, rightly ordered, correctly placed. As the psalmist wrote, "Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart." Notice, carefully, slowly, the order of it. Delight comes first, unhurried, unforced. The desires arrive afterward, as a natural consequence of that delight, never as a reward wrestled painfully out of a reluctant, withholding God who must be convinced or persuaded. I am an irresistible magnet for all that belongs to me by divine right. I am an irresistible magnet for all that belongs to me by divine right. Let delight, and not desperation, be the exact frequency you fall asleep inside of tonight, the very last note playing quietly as the room around you fades. Now, I want to explore what actually happens when longing finally stops being anxious and quietly becomes something much closer to trust, something almost restful in its own right. There is a strength that has nothing whatsoever to do with muscle, or willpower, or gritted teeth, nothing to do with the clenched jaw of effort, a strength Isaiah described in a way that must have sounded almost scandalous to people bracing themselves for an actual battle, sharpening actual swords, gathering actual provisions for a long and grinding fight. As it is written in Isaiah, "In quietness and in confidence shall be your strength," not in the fighting, not in the bracing, not in the endless readiness for a blow that may never even come, in the quiet. Whatever you have been bracing against tonight, in your body, in your plans, in that tight place behind your sternum that has been holding its breath for longer than you can remember, it can unclench now, slowly, completely, one small muscle at a time. The strength was never located in the bracing to begin with. It was waiting, patiently, in the letting go. Florence Scovel Shinn taught something she called living under grace rather than under law, meaning that the old, exhausting world of strict cause and effect, of strict deserving, of careful ledgers kept on every failure and every debt, no longer has to be the only rule you live your one life by. Grace, she said, operates according to an entirely different and far kinder mathematics altogether, one that does not keep score, one that has already, quietly, torn up the ledger altogether. I am under grace and not under law. I am under grace and not under law. Feel how much room that particular truth actually makes. How much of your old, tired scorekeeping simply becomes completely unnecessary, page after page of it drifting quietly away, like ash from a fire long since gone cold. Now, I want to explore what a life actually looks like once it stops being governed by strict deserving and instead starts being gently carried by grace, the way a small boat is carried by a current it never had to create. Jesus did not address his most famous invitation, his warmest one, to the strong or to the accomplished, or to the ones who had already earned their rest through visible, sweated effort. He addressed it directly to the exhausted, the ones who had been carrying something far too heavy for far too long, backs bent, arms trembling with the strain of it, which may be exactly, precisely who is listening to this voice right now, wherever you are, however tired you actually are. As Jesus said, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Not eventually, once you have finally proven your worth to someone, past some final unseen test. Now, exactly as tired as you already, actually are, this very moment, in this very bed, with nothing at all required of you first. Florence Scovel Shinn understood rest as something almost active, a deliberate laying down rather than a passive collapse into unconsciousness, a choice made quietly and on purpose. And the phrase she used for that laying down is one we have already met tonight together, because some truths simply need to be said more than once, spoken again into the dark, before they truly, finally take root deep enough to hold. I cast this burden on the Christ within, and I go free. I cast this burden on the Christ within, and I go free. Let the burden actually land somewhere other than your chest this time, all the way down, all the way gone, further this time than it went before. Now, I want to explore where exactly it goes once it has been cast like that, because it does not simply vanish into nothing, does not disappear the way a worry sometimes only pretends to disappear. It is transformed into something else entirely. There is an old, familiar habit of looking sideways for help, toward circumstances, toward other people, toward the visible size of the problem itself, measuring and remeasuring it, as though staring hard enough might shrink it, and the psalmist, writing what may have originally been a traveler's song, sung along a dusty road with tired feet and a tired heart, redirected that gaze entirely, gently but firmly, lifting it upward like a hand beneath a chin. As the psalmist wrote, "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth." The hills themselves were never the actual source, however solid and impressive they looked against the sky. They simply point upward, quietly, toward where the real help has always originated from. The way a signpost points toward a town it is not itself. Florence Scovel Shinn often reminded her students that the visible world, however impressive it looks, or however frightening it looks, however large it seems to loom across the whole horizon of a life, is never truly the source of anything at all, and that lifting the eyes like this is really just lifting the attention gently away from appearances and back toward the unseen cause, standing quietly behind them, patient and unmoved by whatever storm happens to be passing through the foreground. This, or something better, now manifests for me. This, or something better, now manifests for me. Let your gaze rise now, gently, unhurried, away from the size of whatever problem has followed you into this bed tonight, like a shadow reluctant to be left behind, and toward the far greater size of the help that is already on its way, already closer than the problem itself. Now, I want to explore what changes in a person once help stops being something desperately searched for, and instead becomes something simply, quietly remembered, the way you remember a name you never actually forgot. Freedom, real freedom, is rarely loud, rarely dramatic, rarely announced with any fanfare at all, rarely arrives with trumpets or crowds. Jesus described it almost as a quiet byproduct of something else entirely. Not a battle won through effort, but a truth simply, finally known, recognized the way a face is recognized across a room after years apart. As Jesus said, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Notice, carefully, that it does not say the striving shall make you free, or the fighting, or the endless fixing and rearranging of every small circumstance. The knowing does it, all on its own, quietly, completely. Something recognized clearly enough for what it truly is, stops having power over you, the way it once, quietly, did, the way a shadow loses its menace the instant the lamp is finally lit. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that most limitation is simply a false belief, mistaken for an unchangeable fact, worn so long it began to feel like skin instead of clothing, and that the moment that false belief is finally seen clearly for exactly what it is, it tends to dissolve almost entirely on its own. The way morning fog dissolves the instant real sunlight actually manages to reach it, without struggle, without argument. She placed her trust, again and again, in this exact same gentle release, night after night, trouble after trouble, never once needing a new method for it. Let go and let God. Let go and let God. Notice, gently, what in you already feels a little lighter, simply from being seen clearly and named honestly, without judgment, without flinching away from it. Now, I want to explore what fills the space that a released false belief leaves behind it. Because that particular space, it turns out, does not stay empty for very long at all, not even for a moment. Sometimes the good that is coming toward you does not look anything at all like what came before, arrives wearing a shape you never once anticipated. And this can feel disorienting if you have been quietly expecting your supply to arrive in only the same familiar shapes you already know, through the same door it has always used before. Isaiah spoke of this directly, describing a God who is simply not interested in repeating old patterns for their own sake, out of habit alone, out of mere tradition. As it is written in Isaiah, "Behold, I will do a new thing, now it shall spring forth. Shall ye not know it? Even now it springs forth. Not someday, far off in some distant, uncertain future. Even now, while you rest completely, while your eyes are closed and your breathing has slowed, something entirely unfamiliar and entirely good is already, quietly, forming beneath the surface of things." Florence Scovel Shinn cautioned her students gently against insisting on the old, familiar channel, out of mere habit, out of a kind of fear dressed up as loyalty to what has always worked before, and encouraged them instead to trust the larger will that so often surprises us with something better than we had ever originally imagined for ourselves, something we would never have thought to ask for because we simply did not yet know it existed. She kept her own will humbly beneath that larger, wiser one, again and again, releasing her own small plans for something far more spacious. God's will be done, not mine own. God's will be done, not mine own. Let yourself become genuinely, quietly curious about the shape your good might actually take, rather than clinging tightly to the shape you had originally expected it to arrive in. The way a child releases a tight grip on one toy, the moment something far more wonderful is offered. Now, I want to explore what it feels like to trust a path you cannot yet fully see the end of, not even the next bend of it. There is a particular kind of trust that does not require full visibility, complete certainty, or a map laid out from beginning to end with every turn already marked, the kind Solomon, or whoever wrote so tenderly in his name, described with such patient, practical warmth, the warmth of someone who has walked many roads himself and learned not to fear the dark parts of them. As it is written in Proverbs, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths." Not illuminate the entire road at once, all the way to some distant horizon you cannot even imagine yet. Direct the paths, one single step revealed exactly when it is needed, and not one moment sooner than that, the way a lantern only ever lights the ground directly beneath the traveler's own feet. Florence Scovel Shinn described this same unhurried unfolding as a kind of divine choreography, love moving quietly through circumstances long before you are even aware that any moving is happening at all, arranging outcomes gently on your behalf while you sleep, quite literally, exactly as you are doing right now, this very moment, in this very room, breath slowing, body sinking further into the mattress with each passing minute. Divine love, through me, blesses and prospers all men. Divine love, through me, blesses and prospers all men. Let tonight be one of the nights that choreography quietly, faithfully does its unseen work, step by step, behind the curtain of your sleep, arranging what needs arranging while you do nothing at all but rest. Now I want to explore what it feels like to be provided for, the way the smallest, most overlooked things in creation are already, quietly, provided for, without a single anxious thought of their own. Jesus, teaching outdoors one ordinary afternoon, on a hillside with the wind moving gently through the grass, once simply pointed at the open sky and let the birds themselves make his entire argument for him, needing no further words of his own. As Jesus said, "Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they? No barns anywhere in sight for them, no granaries, no careful storing against some imagined future famine. Fed anyway, day after quiet day, simply because provision was never actually dependent on their own frantic effort in the first place, was never something they had to earn through worry or through work." Florence Scovel Shinn loved this particular teaching precisely because it dismantled the entire myth of scarcity at its very root, pulling it up whole rather than merely trimming its leaves, insisting that if the smallest, least self-sufficient creatures in all of creation are cared for this completely, this thoroughly, without their lifting a single wing in anxious preparation, the fear driving so much exhausted human striving was never actually necessary to begin with, not for one single day of your one life. God is my unfailing supply. God is my unfailing supply. Let something in you finally, quietly stop gathering against a future that was already, all along, fully provided for, long before you ever thought to worry about it. Now, I want to explore what it truly means to be hidden safely inside that provision, even in the seasons of your life that feel most exposed, most uncertain, most out in the open weather. There is a psalm that reads almost like a shelter, built entirely out of language itself, brick by brick, word by word, and Florence Scovel Shinn returned to it often, especially when circumstances around her looked most uncertain, most exposed, most like the weather had turned against her without warning. As it is written in the 91st Psalm, "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." A secret place, notice, not hidden from you, not locked away behind some door you have lost the key to, but hidden within you, always quietly available, entered simply by turning your attention gently there, again and again, however many times it takes, however many nights of practice it requires. She taught that this dwelling was never a location you had to travel to, never a distant place requiring a journey, but a state of consciousness you simply returned to, over and over, whenever fear tried once again to convince you it had the final word after all, whenever the old anxious voice tried to speak louder than the quiet one beneath it. And in that dwelling place, she taught, the very same magnetic law we spoke of earlier tonight continues its quiet work on your behalf, without ceasing, without exception, without ever once clocking out or resting from its task. I am an irresistible magnet for all that belongs to me by divine right. I am an irresistible magnet for all that belongs to me by divine right. Let the shadow of that wing be wide enough tonight to cover every single worry you carried in here with you, every last one, down to the smallest and most easily overlooked. Now, I want to explore what kind of thoughts God actually holds toward you while you rest, because they are far gentler than the ones you have been quietly holding toward yourself, far gentler than you have probably ever allowed yourself to believe. Jeremiah wrote to a people living in genuine exile, in real and difficult circumstances, no metaphor about it at all, far from home, uncertain if home would ever be reachable again, and delivered a message that must have felt almost unbelievable to them at the time it first arrived, almost too generous to be true, as it is written in Jeremiah, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace, and not of evil, to give you an expected end." Thoughts of peace, toward you, specifically, by name, in whatever quiet exile you have been living inside lately, financial or emotional, or simply the long exile of exhaustion itself, the kind that makes even familiar rooms feel far from home. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the human mind, left entirely untended, unwatched, tends naturally to assume the very worst about the future. to write the saddest possible ending to every unfinished story, and that part of the real spiritual work is simply, gently refusing to think worse thoughts about your own life than God is already, quietly, thinking about it. She placed her own will down again here, softly, beside that larger, more peaceful thinking she trusted so completely, laying her own worried drafts aside in favor of the better one already written. I am under grace and not under law. I am under grace and not under law. Let your own expected end, tonight, quietly and gently become a peaceful one, the kind you would not have dared write for yourself, but are being given anyway. Now, I want to explore the single truth this entire night has actually been building toward, from its very first word, the one I asked you, so long ago now it seems, to stay for. Here, at the very end of the long road we have walked together tonight, everything finally gathers into a single point, the way every small tributary eventually finds its way home to the very same river, no matter how far it wandered or how many turns it took along the way. Paul wrote something that sounds almost extravagant when you first hear it, almost too generous to be practical, and yet he meant every single word of it plainly, without exaggeration, without hedging even slightly. As Paul wrote, "And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye, always having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work." All grace, all sufficiency, all things. Not most of them, not the convenient ones, not the important ones only. Carefully selected and rationed out. All. This is where the journey turns fully inward now, all the way inward, past the last of the outer rooms and into the quiet center of the house. Because everything you have heard tonight, every verse, every decree, every gentle release we have practiced together in the dark, has really only ever been preparing the ground for one single identity to take root in you, completely, quietly, permanently. The way a seed planted long ago, finally, one ordinary night, becomes a tree without anyone having watched the exact moment it happened. Not a technique you perform under pressure, not a phrase reserved only for emergencies, not a phrase you recite only when things get difficult, pulled out like a tool from a drawer and put away again afterward. A truth you simply are, the way a river simply is wet, the way light simply is warm, without effort, without trying, without ever having to remind itself of its own nature. Florence Scovel Shinn spent her whole life pointing steadily toward this exact recognition, again and again, in different words each time, patient as the tide itself, that behind every circumstance, every closed door, every empty-looking place in your one life, there stands a source that has never once run dry, and never, ever will, because it was never dependent on the world's economy to begin with, not for one single moment of its long, quiet existence. God is my unfailing supply. God is my unfailing supply. Let that sentence stop being something you merely say and quietly become something you simply are while you sleep tonight, completely, without effort, the way the tide does not strain itself to come in. It simply comes in, again and again, night after night, because it belongs to the shore, and the shore belongs to it, and there was never any question of either one being left without the other. Not once, not ever, not even on the darkest night, either of them has ever known. If you have stayed with me all the way to this moment, all the way from that very first lamp going gently dark, to this final, steady flame we are resting inside of now, something in you has already shifted tonight, whether you can feel the shift yet or not, whether it announces itself loudly or simply settles in quietly beside you like an old friend who has finally come home. That kind of staying, all the way through, is rare, and I do not take it lightly, not for a single moment, not tonight, and not on any other night either. If this channel has slowly become a place your nervous system has learned to trust, a room it recognizes even in the dark, consider subscribing so that we can keep meeting like this, quietly, night after night, verse answering decree, decree answering verse, until the whole pattern simply becomes who you are, without you ever having to try, without you ever having to force a single thing. And before you drift the rest of the way down into sleep, would you leave these 2 words in the comments below, just so I know this landed exactly where it needed to land tonight, exactly where it was always meant to arrive. God supplies. That is all. Just 2 words, left quietly like a small stone, marking the exact place where something in you finally, truly let go. If tonight gave you even a little more rest than you arrived with, even the smallest measure more than you carried in through the door, alike helps this find the next tired person lying awake somewhere, quietly needing the very same thing you needed tonight, the very same quiet you have just been given. And when you wake, whenever that is, however far off that waking feels from this exact moment, there is another journey waiting for you, right below this one, ready for the next night your mind wants to be led gently, patiently home again. Rest now. You are provided for. You always were, from the very beginning, long before you ever thought to ask, long before you even knew there was anyone to ask at all. If this teaching finds you, your broke years are ending. Don't skip. Florence Scovel Shinn. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the very moment you stop straining and struggling for supply is the moment supply comes rushing to meet you halfway. And if you have ever lain awake doing math you did not want to do, this teaching was written for the exact room you are sitting in right now. There is a verse tucked into the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, verse 24, and it reads like this: "Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear." And Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The answer was never waiting on your calling. The answer was already spoken before the need ever left your lips, which means your broke years were never waiting on the economy to change, or the job to come through, or the check to arrive. They were waiting on you to stop calling out from lack and start speaking from a supply that was already given. And here is where most people miss it entirely. They think the way out of broke is to work harder at getting, when Florence Scovel Shinn taught plainly that the way out of broke is to stop assuming lack as your identity, because it is not the empty account that keeps you poor, it is the full belief in the emptiness that keeps the account that way. So before we go any further, let us give your lips something new to say, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the spoken word is a creative power moving out into the unseen to shape the scene, and lack simply cannot survive very long in a mouth that keeps decreeing supply. So say it with me now. My supply is already spoken, my faith is already active, my word is my wand, and again, my supply is already spoken, my faith is already active, my word is my wand. Now if something in you just went quiet when you heard that, if some old, tired, worn-out part of you finally exhaled, then type these 2 words in the comments below: end of broke years. Let it be your seal. Let it be the line drawn between who you have been and who you are quietly becoming. The first key is understanding that broke was never a condition of your bank account. It is a state of consciousness you agreed to and then mistook for a fact. And this distinction is everything, because a fact cannot be argued with, but a state can always be changed. Picture the woman who checks her banking app 5 times before lunch, watching the same number, feeling the same drop in her stomach each time, as though checking harder might change what is written there. She checks it once on the drive to work, again in the parking lot, again at her desk before the first meeting, again after lunch, again before she falls asleep, and each time the number has not moved, but something inside her has, a little tighter, a little more convinced, a little more certain that this is simply who she is now, the one who is always short. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is precisely backward, because you do not change an outer number by staring at it in fear, you change it by withdrawing your attention from the appearance and placing it on the truth behind the appearance. It is not the account that is empty, it is the acceptance that has been empty, run for years without question, and here is what makes this so easy to miss. The number on the screen feels like the most honest thing in the room. It feels like proof. It feels like the one thing that cannot be argued with. And yet Florence Scovel Shinn would gently ask you, whose report are you going to believe? The report of the appearance, or the report of the truth, that supply is already spoken and already yours? This is not a small rhetorical question. It is the entire hinge the rest of your life swings on, and once you see that broke is a state you can actually walk out of, the way you would walk out of a room that has grown too small for you, something in the chest loosens, because a state can be changed, where a fact feels fixed, and this is not denial of the number on the screen, it is refusal to let that number be the last word on your life. Florence Scovel Shinn would say the last word belongs to the word you speak next, not the number staring back at you. So this week, when you catch yourself opening that app out of fear rather than need, pause, right there in the parking lot, or the kitchen, or wherever you happen to be standing, and say quietly, "This number describes where I have been. It does not describe where my word is now taking me," and let that be enough for today. Because once the state shifts, the number is simply the last thing to catch up. It always is. It never leads. And you will spend the rest of your life watching the outer world explain what your consciousness has already declared. And the state you hold in secret is far louder than the number on any screen, far louder than the bill in the mailbox, far louder than the balance glowing on the glass. And that state is exactly what we turn to next. I refuse the appearance of lack, and I claim the fact of supply. The second key is seeing that your state of consciousness is the actual supply chain running underneath your life, more real than any paycheck, more binding than any contract. Picture two women, both with the same rent due on the first, both short by the same amount. One paces the kitchen at midnight, rehearsing the eviction notice she has not received, feeding her fear with every worst outcome her mind can invent, and the other sits still, breathes, and simply says, "Supply meets me at the exact point of my need," and rests there, not pretending the bill does not exist, but refusing to marry her identity to the fear of it. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that these two women are not living in the same world at all, though their circumstances look identical on paper, because one is broadcasting a state of panic into the unseen, and one is broadcasting a state of expectancy, and the unseen has no choice but to answer whatever is broadcast most consistently. It is not the rent that is threatening either woman. It is the feeling of threat that one of them has been renting out room in her own mind for years, paying it interest daily in worry. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say the outer rent is small compared to the inner rent charged by a fearful state held too long. Now widen this a little further, because the same law is not only working on rent, it is working in every ordinary transaction of the day. Picture a man scrolling job listings late at night, applying to 5, 10, 15 postings, and with every single click, a small voice underneath, saying, "They will not want me. This will not work either." And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, "Notice. He is applying with his hands, while declining himself in his own heart. And no amount of applications can outrun a state that has already decided the answer before it arrives, because the state is the actual signal going out. The application is only the outer motion. This is why two people can send out the very same number of requests, the very same effort, the very same qualifications, and one is met with door after door quietly opening, while the other collects rejection after rejection. And it was never about the resume, it was about which state stood behind the hand that pressed send. It is not the circumstance that decides your supply, it is the state you hold about the circumstance. This is worth saying slowly, because it corrects the oldest mistake in the mind, the mistake of believing the outer condition is the cause, when it was only ever the effect. The rent is not the cause of her fear. Her fear was already present long before the rent came due. The rejection is not the cause of his discouragement. The discouragement was already sitting in the state before the listing was even opened. And once you see this clearly, you stop trying to negotiate with circumstances and start negotiating with the only thing that was ever actually in charge, the state itself. Here is the part that changes everything once you truly absorb it. The state you hold is not decided by your circumstance. It is decided by you, moment to moment. Which means the woman pacing the kitchen has the very same access to rest that the other woman has. She has simply not yet claimed it, and the man refreshing job listings at midnight has the very same access to quiet expectancy that would change everything about how his effort lands. He has simply not yet remembered it is his to claim. So pause for a moment right now and pick one real circumstance currently pressing on you. A bill, a job, a decision, and ask honestly, what state have I been holding about this? Not what have I been doing about it. What have I been feeling underneath the doing? Because that feeling is the actual signal traveling ahead of you into rooms you have not even entered yet. So this week, when a bill or a demand lands in your hands and your stomach tightens, do not argue with the tightening. Just notice it, name it gently, and say, I am not required to hold this state. I choose instead the state of supply already meeting me, and say it as many times as the fear returns, because the fear will return. That is what old states do. They knock on the door out of habit, long after you have changed the locks. But each time you answer the door with the new word, instead of the old fear, the state is strengthened a little further, until one day the knocking simply stops. Because the words you speak repeatedly are what built the fearful state in the first place, and it is to those very words we turn now. I choose the state of supply, and I let all lesser states pass through. The third key is recognizing that the spoken word is your wand, quite literally, and it works whether you are aiming it on purpose or not. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that words spoken in faith become law just as surely as words spoken in fear become law. The unseen does not grade your words for good intention. It simply takes the word and gets to work building the matching form. Picture the man who has said for 15 years, I can never hold on to money, said it at family dinners as a joke, said it to co-workers as small talk, said it to himself in the mirror as a kind of resigned honesty, and watch how faithfully his outer life has arranged itself to prove him right, not because money is cruel to him, but because his own mouth has been continually decreeing the very condition he complains about. It is not the universe punishing him for something he did. It is his own words returning to him, dressed up as circumstance, appearing so naturally that he never once suspects his own voice as the author. And Florence Scovel Shinn would gently stop him and say, your words are not describing your life, they are building it, brick by spoken brick. And it is never only the big dramatic sentences that do this work. It is the small automatic ones, the ones said so quickly they barely feel like decrees at all. Picture a woman standing at a checkout counter, glancing at a total slightly higher than she expected, and hearing herself say, of course, that is just my luck, said lightly, almost as a reflex, said the way a person clears their throat. And yet Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the unseen does not weigh a sentence by how casually it was said. It simply hears the sentence and moves to fulfill it. So that woman, without ever meaning to, has quietly renewed a subscription to bad luck she never consciously signed up for in the first place. And she will do it again tomorrow, at another counter, over another small thing, each time believing she is merely describing a fact, when she is actually laying another brick. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn taught that idle words are rarely idle at all. A sentence like, I never catch a break, spoken absent-mindedly while waiting for coffee, is still a full decree. A sentence like, "Money just slips through my fingers," spoken while laughing about a purchase, is still a full decree. The tone can be light, the intention can be harmless, and the unseen will still take it seriously, because it does not read your mood, it reads your word. And this is also the good news hiding inside the same law, because it means the smallest daily sentence carries just as much creative weight as the largest declared prayer. So this week, listen to your own casual sentences, the way you would listen to a stranger you were curious about. Notice what you say about money without thinking. Notice the little jokes, the little sighs, the little I never haves, and each time you catch one, do not scold yourself. Simply replace it on the spot. Say instead, "My word is my wand, and I aim it now toward supply," because a wand does not care how long it was pointed the wrong direction. It only cares where it is pointed now. And once you begin guarding your speech this closely, you will notice something remarkable. The very same tongue that built the broke years is fully capable of building what comes after them, and that rebuilding begins with the deeper matter of what you actually believe yourself to be. My word is my wand, and I aim it only toward supply. The fourth key is understanding that beneath every state, beneath every spoken word, sits the deepest layer of all, your self-concept, the quiet, private answer you give yourself when nobody is asking, when you whisper to your own soul who you actually are. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this self-concept is the blueprint the entire outer life is built from, more powerful than any single wish, more binding than any single circumstance. Because you cannot out-earn a self-concept that believes it is small. You cannot out-save a self-concept that believes it is behind. You can win a windfall and watch it slip through your fingers within months, if the self-concept underneath still whispers, "I am the kind of person money does not stay with." And this is why so many people experience a strange cycle. A raise arrives, and within weeks the expenses rise to match it. A gift arrives, and within days something breaks that costs exactly that amount, and they call it bad luck. But Florence Scovel Shinn would call it something else entirely. She would call it a self-concept balancing the books to match its own quiet belief, because the outer world is endlessly loyal to the inner claim. Whether that claim was chosen consciously or absorbed by accident in childhood. First, consider where this self-concept was formed. Most people never chose it on purpose. It was handed to them. A father who flinched every time the electric bill arrived. A mother who said money does not grow on trees so often that it became scripture. A household where scarcity was simply the weather everyone lived under. And a child does not question weather. A child simply learns to dress for it and grows into an adult still buttoning up the same old coat against a storm that may not even be forecast anymore, still flinching at bills out of old habit long after the actual danger has passed. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the first task is simply naming this, not blaming anyone for it, but naming it clearly, saying to yourself, "This belief about money was given to me. It was not born with me, and what was given can be exchanged for something truer." Second, consider how quietly this self-concept operates once it has settled in, because it rarely announces itself as a belief at all. It disguises itself as simple realism. Picture a man who has worked the same steady job for years, capable, well-liked, quietly overlooked every time a promotion is handed out. And when a co-worker with far less experience is chosen instead, he tells himself the company simply does not value loyalty, and perhaps that is even partly true. But Florence Scovel Shinn would ask you to look one layer deeper, because this same man, without realizing it, has spent 15 years describing himself as the reliable one who stays in the background, the steady hand nobody thinks to promote, and he has said it so often, in so many small ways, that his own bearing in every meeting quietly confirms it. He sits a little further back. He offers his best ideas privately, instead of in the room where decisions are made. He apologizes before he speaks, None of this is conscious sabotage. It is simply a self-concept fully at work, arranging his posture, his timing, his very presence to match what he has quietly decided about himself. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that no promotion, no lucky break, no outside kindness can override a self-concept that has not yet agreed to change, because the world is only ever answering the question you have already answered about yourself. Third, consider that the self-concept can be caught red-handed in the small, ordinary moments of a day, not only in the big, dramatic ones. So pause for a moment right now and pick one real belief you carry about yourself, around money, something specific, not vague. Perhaps it is I am always the one who has to make do with less. Or perhaps it is people like me do not get the easy breaks. Hold that sentence in your mind for a moment and simply ask, whose voice was this originally? Because most of the time, when you trace it back far enough, it was never fully your own voice to begin with. It was borrowed, and a borrowed belief can absolutely be returned. Fourth, consider that this self-concept does not only shape the big decisions, it shapes the tiny ones you never even noticed deciding, the item quietly put back on the shelf before checking the price at all, the smaller portion ordered out of habit rather than hunger, the compliment on a raise or a new car that gets brushed off with a joke instead of received simply. All of these are the self-concept speaking in whispers, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the whispers matter every bit as much as the declarations, because a life is built far more from its habitual whispers than from its rare dramatic statements. So it is worth listening closely this week to what you whisper to yourself in exactly these small, unguarded moments, not the moments you rehearse, but the moments you forget anyone is listening, including yourself. Fifth, consider the replacing itself. And this is where Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching becomes wonderfully practical rather than merely comforting, because she taught that you do not argue the old self-concept into silence. You simply stop feeding it and begin feeding a new one instead. So where the old sentence was, I am always the one who has to make do with less, you plant instead, I am the one supply flows toward easily and naturally, and you plant it, not as a hopeful wish, but as a decree, spoken with the same weight you once gave the fear, quietly, repeatedly, especially in the exact moments the old belief tries to surface, because that is precisely the soil it needs to be replanted in. And this replanting is rarely dramatic. It looks like the man from before, sitting slightly closer to the front of the room, offering his idea a moment sooner than he normally would. Small, almost unnoticeable shifts, and yet each one is the new self-concept, taking its first careful steps into the visible world. And here is the part most people never realize until it is pointed out plainly. The world you are currently living in, the specific texture of your bank balance, your job, the way opportunities do or do not seem to find you, all of it is simply the self-concept of yesterday, fully grown and standing in front of you, wearing a coat made of circumstance. It is not a verdict on your worth. It is only a photograph of a belief you held some time ago, developed and printed in full, which means the self-concept you plant today is the photograph developing right now for the months ahead. So this week, catch yourself in the ordinary moments, standing in line at the store, opening an email, glancing at a price tag, sitting quietly in a meeting where you might normally hold back, and ask gently, what am I assuming about myself in this moment? And if the assumption is small, replace it not with strain, but with the calm certainty of someone quietly correcting an old rumor about themselves, the way you might correct a stranger who has your name slightly wrong, without anger, simply with clarity. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this correcting, done patiently and repeatedly, is one of the most powerful acts available to any human being, because it is not fighting the outer world at all. It is simply retiring the inner author who wrote the version you no longer wish to live inside. and letting a truer author quietly take up the pen instead. I am the one supply flows toward, easily and by nature. The fifth key is short, and it needs to be, because some truths land better as a quick, clean strike than a long explanation. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the old self-concept does not simply fade on its own. It must be let die. And here we pause to be very clear about what that word means. This is never the death of you. It is only the death of a false idea about you, the small, tired identity that called itself broke, that called itself behind, that called itself the one who never gets the break. That identity is not who you are. It was only ever a coat you were handed, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that grieving that coat is allowed, but wearing it forever is not required. Picture a woman who finally stops introducing herself with the phrase, "I have always struggled with money," a sentence she has repeated at parties, in therapy, to new friends, as though it were simply a fact about her eye color, and one day she simply stops saying it, not because her bank account changed first, but because she decided the sentence no longer described the person she was becoming, and within months her circumstances quietly caught up to the new sentence, because the old identity had finally been allowed to end, and something truer was finally given room to stand in its place. This is not loss, it is release. The same way a snake is not harmed by shedding a skin it had already outgrown. It is not tragedy when the coat comes off. It is simply that the coat was never the body wearing it. And so much fear around money comes from mistaking the coat for the skin, clinging to a worn-out identity purely because it is familiar. And familiarity can feel like safety, even when it is actually just an old kind of suffering you have learnt the shape of. Florence Scovel Shinn would ask you plainly, would you keep sleeping in a house simply because you knew where all the furniture was, even after the roof had begun caving in? Of course not. And yet this is precisely what an unquestioned identity does. It keeps you sleeping in a collapsing house out of loyalty to the furniture. So notice this week whenever you feel a strange pull to defend an old money story about yourself, a flicker of almost wanting to keep saying, "I have always been the one who struggles," because some part of you may quietly feel that giving it up means admitting the years of hardship meant nothing, and Florence Scovel Shinn would gently correct that fear too. The years were never wasted. They were simply the ground this new word is now allowed to grow from. Letting the old identity die does not erase what you lived through. It honors it by finally letting it finish. So this week, find one sentence you have said about yourself and money for years without questioning it, and simply retire it, out loud if you can. Let it be finished, and let the door it closes be the very door the next key walks through. I release the old identity, and I let the truer one stand. The sixth key is gratitude, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that gratitude is not a soft afterthought, tacked onto prayer as a polite formality. She taught it as an active multiplying force, the fastest way she knew to lift a state of lack into a state of supply. And here is the reason it works so precisely. You cannot hold genuine gratitude and genuine fear in the same breath at the same time. They simply will not occupy the same room together. So the moment gratitude enters, fear is quietly required to leave, not fought, not wrestled down, simply crowded out, the way light crowds out darkness, without ever needing to battle it. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught something else about gratitude that most people rush past. She taught that it must be specific to carry any real weight. A vague "thank you for everything" floats past the soul without landing anywhere, but a precise, particular thank you plants itself immediately. So let us walk through an ordinary day the way most people actually live it, and watch the difference precision makes hour by hour. At 7 in the morning, the alarm sounds, and the first thought is already about the bill due on Friday, a small dread settling in before the feet even touch the floor. At 8, the coffee is made, while the mind quietly recites the numbers again, lack rehearsed before the day has properly started. At 9, the commute begins, and the radio mentions the economy, and the dread deepens, fed now by outside noise as well as inside noise. At 10, a co-worker mentions a raise, and instead of joy, there is a small ache of not enough. At noon, lunch is eaten quickly, distracted, the mind circling the same worn groove. At 2, an unexpected expense email arrives, and the whole body tightens. At 5, the drive home is spent replaying the tightness. At 8, the evening is spent scrolling, comparing, gathering more evidence of being behind. And at 11, sleep finally comes. But it is not rest. It is only exhaustion. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, "Look how many hours were spent decreeing lack, without one complaint ever leaving the lips, all of it silent, all of it just as binding as if it had been shouted from a rooftop." Now walk through that same day again, but this time gratitude is placed at the very start, specific and named, at 7, before the feet touch the floor. A simple line, "Thank you for the supply that met me while I slept." At 8, while pouring the coffee, "Thank you for this exact warmth in my hands right now." Not gratitude in general, gratitude for this particular cup. At 9, during the commute, instead of absorbing the economic noise, a quiet decree, "My supply is not tied to that story." At 10, when the co-worker mentions their raise, a genuine "good for them," spoken instead of comparison, because gratitude for another's supply announces that supply is available at all. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that resenting another's blessing is one of the surest ways to block your own. At noon, lunch eaten slowly, thankfully. At 2, when the unexpected expense arrives, a breath, then, "Thank you that I am shown exactly what is needed, instead of being surprised by it." At 5, driving home, gratitude for the miles behind. And at 11, sleep that is actually rest, because the entire day was built from a different material, same bills, same schedule, same actual numbers, but an entirely different state, carried through every single hour. Think for a moment of the woman who kept a small jar on her kitchen counter, and every evening before bed, she dropped in a coin, not because the coin itself mattered, but because dropping it required her to name one specific thing that day that supply had already provided. The ride that got her home safely, the meal that was somehow enough, the phone call that arrived at the exact right moment, and within a season she noticed something she had not expected. Opportunities she had overlooked for years suddenly seemed to appear everywhere, and Florence Scovel Shinn would say nothing new had actually appeared. The supply had been there all along. Gratitude had simply trained her eye to finally see it, because an untrained eye looks directly at abundance and still reports lack, while a trained eye looks at very little and still reports plenty. And the difference between those two women was never the amount of supply present. It was the amount of gratitude spoken. So this week, try keeping a small, quiet gratitude count. 3 specific things named each morning before the feet touch the floor. Not vague, not generic, specific. This exact cup of coffee, this exact roof, this exact working pair of hands. Because specific gratitude trains the eye to notice supply already present. And an eye trained to notice supply already present becomes an eye that supply cannot resist finding again and again. This is not a small habit tucked at the edges of a spiritual life. Florence Scovel Shinn considered it one of the most direct paths back to abundance available to anyone, in any circumstance, starting from any bank balance whatsoever, because gratitude does not wait for the harvest to admire the seed. And once gratitude has retrained the eye this thoroughly, it becomes possible to face something even larger, the question of how much resistance you have been quietly carrying against the very life you say you want. Thank you for the supply already meeting me this very hour. The 7th key is the deepest one, and it deserves to be taken slowly, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught something here that quietly overturns almost everything the broke years trained you to believe. She taught that supply does not arrive through force, it arrives through non-resistance, through a settled trust she often described simply as faith, and this single teaching is worth unfolding piece by piece, because it changes not only what you do, but what you stop doing, and it is the one key that all the others have secretly been preparing you to receive first. Consider the exhausting habit of forcing. Most people who have lived through broke years have learned to grip, to push, to chase every possible opportunity out of a fear that if they relax even slightly, everything will collapse. And this gripping feels responsible. It feels like diligence. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught that gripping is actually a confession of disbelief. It says quietly underneath itself, I do not trust that supply is already arranged for me, so I must force it into existence through sheer effort. And here is the strange result she observed again and again. The harder people gripped, the more supply seemed to slip through their fingers, like trying to hold water in a closed fist. Whereas the moment the grip loosened, even slightly, the water remained. This is not a call to stop working, it is a call to stop working from fear. Because Florence Scovel Shinn drew a sharp line between effort born of joy and effort born of panic. The first builds, the second depletes, even when the actions look identical from the outside. And this is precisely why two people can work the very same number of hours at the very same task, and one rises while the other simply wears down further. The hours were equal, but the fuel underneath them was not. Second, consider what she meant by faith, not a vague, hopeful feeling, but an active, settled knowing. The kind of knowing a person has when they flip a light switch. They do not beg the light to come on. They do not doubt it while flipping it. They simply flip it, expecting light, because they have seen the pattern proven so many times that doubt does not even arise. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this same ordinary, unremarkable confidence is available regarding supply. Not because supply has been proven to you yet in this particular area, but because it has been proven in every corner of nature that continually gives without strain. The sun does not force itself to rise. The tide does not grip the shore in anxiety. The field does not panic before the harvest. All of it simply unfolds according to law, and you were never excluded from that same law. You only forgot you were included in it. And it is worth sitting with that for a moment, because the same law that ripens the field without struggle was never suspended the day you were born short on money. It kept running quietly underneath you the entire time, waiting only for your permission to be trusted. Third, let us walk through a single ordinary week, the way forcing actually plays out, because it is easier to release a habit once you have watched it in daylight. Picture a man waiting on a client to pay an invoice that is already 10 days late. On Monday, he checks his email 17 times before noon. Each refresh a small, silent prayer, built entirely from fear. On Tuesday, he drafts a follow-up message, deletes it, drafts it again, wording it so carefully it takes him an hour. Because some part of him believes that if he simply finds the perfect sentence, he can force the money into existence a day sooner. On Wednesday, he calls a friend and spends 40 minutes rehearsing every worst outcome, the client vanishing, the account going further into the negative, the whole story spinning further from the one actual fact in front of him, which was simply that a payment was late. On Thursday, he wakes at 4 in the morning with his jaw tight, having gripped even in his sleep, and by Friday, he is so worn down from 5 days of gripping that when the payment finally does arrive, he barely feels relief, only exhaustion. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, look closely. Nothing he did that week actually moved the payment one single day sooner. The invoice arrived exactly when it arrived. The only thing all that gripping accomplished was 5 days of suffering layered on top of one delay. Now picture the same man, living that same week, differently. Monday, he sends one clear message and releases it. Tuesday, when the urge to check rises, he says quietly, "This is being handled," and returns to the work in front of him. Wednesday, instead of rehearsing worst outcomes with a friend, he simply says, "Another door is already open if this one is slow." Thursday, he sleeps fully, because the fear had nowhere left to attach itself. And Friday, when the payment arrives, he receives it calmly, almost expected, because he had never truly left the state of trust long enough for the arrival to feel like rescue. Same invoice, same 10 days, same eventual payment, but 1 week was suffering and the other was simply waiting. And this is exactly what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she taught that the circumstance rarely changes as fast as the state around it can. The calendar did not bend for him, but his own week became livable either way. And that is the part so easily overlooked. Faith does not always shorten the wait. Sometimes its true gift is simply making the wait bearable, even pleasant, rather than something to be survived. Fourth, consider the still water itself. Picture a lake at night, undisturbed, and how perfectly it reflects the moon across its whole surface. Now picture that same lake, if a stone is thrown into it again and again. The reflection breaks apart into fragments, unable to hold a clear image of anything at all. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a mind constantly disturbed by fear about money is exactly like that broken reflection. It cannot clearly receive the guidance, the ideas, the opportunities that are actually available, because the surface will not sit still long enough to reflect them. Whereas a mind at rest, even amid real bills, even amid real uncertainty, becomes like the undisturbed lake, capable of receiving clear direction, a sudden idea, a name that comes to mind unbidden, a door that opens quietly. All of these are received far more easily by stillness than by panic. This is why so many people report that their best financial ideas came to them not while frantically searching, but while walking, while resting, while doing something unrelated entirely. The lake had simply gone still enough to reflect what was already there. And it is worth noticing that the lake was never asked to manufacture the moon. It was only asked to stop throwing stones at itself, long enough to show what was already shining above it the entire time. Fifth, consider that this non-resistance is not passive resignation. It is active trust. There is a difference between giving up and letting go. Giving up says nothing will change, so why bother? Letting go says the change is already arranged, so I release my grip on how and when. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this letting go is often the very last thing standing between a person and the supply they have been chasing for years. Because the chasing itself, born of fear, was pushing away the very thing it wanted to pull close. Much like a person gripping a bird too tightly out of fear it will fly away, only to have it struggle free precisely because of the grip. And much like our man with his invoice, spending 5 days gripping a payment that was never his to force in the first place, only his to trust. And this is worth repeating in plain terms, because it is so easily missed. Letting go is not the absence of care, it is care finally aimed correctly, at the state, instead of at the clock. Sixth, notice also how forcing quietly disguises itself as virtue. It tells you that checking the account for the 10th time is simply being responsible, that rehearsing disaster with a friend is simply being realistic, that losing sleep over a late payment is simply being a good provider. And Florence Scovel Shinn would gently correct every one of these. She taught that true responsibility takes the next right action once, clearly and calmly, and then rests, while fear disguised as responsibility takes no new action at all. It simply repeats the same anxious lap around the same worn track, mistaking motion for progress. And it is worth asking honestly this week, when I grip something tightly, am I actually doing something useful with that grip? Or am I simply suffering in a way that feels productive because it is familiar? Because the mind is remarkably clever at dressing old fear in the costume of new diligence, and only a very honest look will tell the two apart. Seventh, Consider too that this key is not only for the large, frightening sums, it is just as much for the small daily frictions, the extra few dollars at the pump, the slightly higher grocery total, the small unexpected fee on a statement. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the law does not distinguish between a great fear and a small one, it simply answers whatever state is held. So the person who grips tightly over a few extra dollars is practicing the very same resistance as the person gripping over a much larger sum, only in miniature. And this means the small frictions of an ordinary day are actually the safest, lowest cost place to practice trust, because the stakes feel small enough that the new muscle can be built gently before it is ever asked to hold something heavier. Eighth, and finally, consider what it feels like practically to live this way for even one single day. You wake, and instead of immediately checking the number, you simply say, "Supply is arranged for me today." You go about the tasks in front of you with genuine attention rather than anxious multitasking. When a worry rises, you notice it without feeding it. You breathe. You return to stillness. When evening comes, you do not tally the day in fear. You simply give thanks that you were carried through it. And you sleep. Not because every problem was solved, but because you trusted the solving was underway, even while you rested. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a week lived this way changes a person more thoroughly than a year lived gripping ever could. Because it is not the frantic hours that build a life, it is the settled ones. So this week, choose one single fear about money that has been gripping you tightly, and simply set it down, not by solving it instantly, but by saying, "This is being handled," and returning your attention to stillness each time it tries to rise again, and watch what begins to surface in that quiet, because it is often in that very stillness that guidance finally has room to speak. I release my grip, and I trust the supply already arranged. The eighth key is guidance, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that once the state has settled and the grip has loosened, a quieter voice becomes far easier to hear. She called it intuition. Sometimes she called it the still small voice, and she taught that it functions almost like an inner detective instinct, always available, always accurate, but easily drowned out by fear and noise. And it is worth understanding this key slowly, because most people have been trained their whole lives to trust only what can be proven on paper, and to dismiss the quiet inner pull as fancy, or coincidence, or nothing at all. First, consider what this voice actually sounds like. It is rarely loud. It does not shout. It does not argue. It simply nudges. A sudden urge to call someone you have not spoken to in months, and you nearly ignore it, but you call anyway, and it turns out they needed exactly that call. Or they mention an opening that becomes exactly the door you needed, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this was never coincidence. This is guidance operating quietly and continuously, offering direction long before the outer world confirms it makes any logical sense at all. Second, consider the woman who felt a strange pull one Tuesday morning to walk a different route to the market. No reason given, no logic attached, only a quiet inward tug, and she almost dismissed it as foolishness, almost kept her usual path out of habit. But she followed it instead, and along that different route, she ran into an old colleague she had not seen in years, a conversation that led, 3 weeks later, to the very opportunity that finally lifted her out of years of struggle. And she would tell you plainly that nothing about that morning looked significant while it was happening. It only became clear afterward, and this is precisely how guidance so often works. It rarely announces its importance in the moment. It simply asks to be followed on trust. Third, consider why this voice is so often missed. It is not because it stopped speaking. It is because fear had turned the volume of the mind too high to hear it. Picture a radio playing softly in a room full of shouting. The music was there the entire time, faithfully playing, but no one could hear a single note of it over the noise. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that financial panic is exactly this kind of shouting. It drowns the small, clear signal underneath it. So the task is never to make the guidance louder. The task is only to quiet the room enough for what was already playing to finally be heard. Fourth, consider the ordinary shape of a nudge, because it rarely arrives dressed as guidance. It arrives disguised as an ordinary thought you almost talk yourself out of, a class you almost do not take, a book you almost do not open, a name that surfaces for no clear reason while you are washing dishes, a hesitation that rises before signing something, and each of these deserves to be treated with respect rather than waved away as random, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that intuition is one of the primary channels supply uses to reach a person. Far more often than the dramatic windfall so many secretly hope for, supply rarely arrives with trumpets. It usually arrives quietly and asks only to be noticed. Fifth, consider an exercise you can try this very week. Each morning, before the day fills with noise, sit for 1 quiet minute and simply ask, is there anything I am being nudged toward today? And then let whatever rises, rise, without judging it as silly or too small. A name, a place, a small errand, a phone call, and follow just one of these nudges deliberately, not recklessly, simply attentively, and notice what unfolds. Because it is not the size of the nudge that matters, it is the practice of listening that slowly rebuilds the connection. And once you begin honoring these nudges consistently, something remarkable happens. The guidance becomes clearer and more frequent, not because it increased, but because your willingness to listen increased, and a person who listens well moves through their days with a quiet efficiency, wasting less time gripping the wrong door, spending more time walking calmly through the right one. And this is precisely the difference between years spent forcing supply through sheer effort and years spent being led gently toward it. It is not that the world grew kinder, it is that the ears finally opened, and once guidance becomes a steady companion rather than a rare surprise, the entire relationship to money begins to feel less like survival and more like partnership, as though the unseen has been working alongside you all along, quietly, patiently, waiting only for enough stillness to be heard clearly. And this partnership is what carries a person fully out of the broke years and into something sturdier, something that does not depend on one lucky break, but on an ongoing, living, responsive relationship with supply itself. I follow the quiet nudge, and I trust where it leads. The ninth key is simply this: let the broke years actually close. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that many people do everything right. They shift their state, they guard their words, they rebuild their self-concept, they practice gratitude, they release the grip, they listen for guidance, and yet they keep one foot standing in the old room out of habit, still introducing themselves by the years that were hard, still bracing for the return of a past that has already finished its work. And she taught gently that a door left open on purpose still lets the old draft in. So let this be the moment the door is finally allowed to close. Not slammed in fear, but closed the way you close a door on a room you have simply outgrown, with a kind of tenderness for who you were in there, because that person did their best with what they knew at the time, and they are the very reason you are standing here now. Capable of hearing all of this, picture the woman who finally has enough to buy the good coffee, the fresh-cut flowers, the coat that fits instead of the one that was simply cheap, and still finds herself standing in the clearance aisle, out of habit, still finds herself flinching when the waiter sets down the check, still finds herself saying, "Oh, I could never." Before she has even looked at the price, her circumstances have changed, but her permission has not caught up, and Florence Scovel Shinn would say this is the door standing open a crack, long after the room behind it emptied out. The broke years are technically over, yet she is still furnishing her days as though they are not. still speaking, as though scarcity were a loyalty she owes someone, and nothing outside of her holds that door open, only her own quiet unwillingness to believe the room is actually empty now. So consider what closing the door truly requires. It is not a single dramatic decision made once and never revisited. It is a small daily choosing, the same way a door must actually be pushed shut rather than merely noticed. This week, when an old broke-year habit rises, the flinch at the receipt, the reflex to say "I cannot afford it" before you have even checked, the automatic reaching for the smallest size, the cheapest version, the tightest portion, pause there gently and ask, am I furnishing today from the old room or from the one I actually live in now? And let the answer be spoken plainly, this room is finished, and I no longer decorate my life to match it. And here is the mercy hidden inside this key. Closing the door does not require that every bill be paid in full. It does not require perfect proof before you are allowed to believe it. Faith was never meant to wait for proof. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the door closes by decision first, and the evidence follows after, quietly, in its own time. So today, before anything outward has changed at all, you are still permitted to say, "It is finished," and mean it fully. Because meaning it fully is precisely what lets it become true. So take one small, quiet moment now, and speak to the version of you who lived through the hardest of it, the one who did the sums at midnight, the one who flinched at envelopes, the one who whispered the tired old sentences without even noticing, and simply say to them, "Thank you, it is finished. We are safe now." Let that be the final closing of the broke years, not because every bill has vanished overnight, but because the identity that generated them has been gently, thoroughly, completely retired, and a door once closed with tenderness rarely needs to be closed twice. It is finished. The broke years are closing, and I am safe now. Here is the whole picture. Broke was never your bank account. It was a state mistaken for a fact, and the state was built from words spoken so often they hardened into a self-concept, and that self-concept had to be released the way an old coat is finally set down, and gratitude retrained the eye to notice supply already present, and stillness replaced the exhausting grip of forcing with the quiet confidence of faith, and guidance became audible the moment the inner lake settled enough to reflect it clearly. And none of these were ever 9 separate keys at all. They were 9 turns of the very same key, the recognition that supply has been speaking to you all along, before you called, exactly as the verse promised, and your only task was ever to become quiet enough and truthful enough in your own speech to finally hear it. And if you want a steady hand walking beside you while all of this settles into daily practice, there is something built exactly for that. It is called the Overflow Covenant, a daily companion of decrees, teachings, and gentle practices drawn straight from this same well of truth, priced simply at $27, fully covered by a 30-day guarantee, so there is nothing to risk in trying it, only the broke years left to lose. You will find the link in the description below, and if you feel even a small, quiet pull toward it, Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you plainly, that pull is guidance, and guidance is always worth following. So let us close the way we began, together. My supply is already spoken. My faith is already active. My word is my wand. And if this teaching found you today, let it be no accident, because before you called, it was already answered, and your broke years, quietly, gently, completely, are ending.
7 signs you're about to win the lottery. Real stories. Florence Scovel Shinn. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the windfall you have been praying for sends its signs ahead of itself, quietly, into the very room you are standing in right now. And if you have ever felt something shift before a single dollar showed up, this teaching is for you. There is an old promise tucked into the book of Malachi, the 3rd chapter, the 10th verse, and it reads like this: Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. And Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, do you see it? The windows are already built. They are already hinged. They are already waiting to swing wide. The only question left is whether you are living in the state of consciousness that opens them, or the state that keeps them painted shut. And this is where so many good and sincere people go quietly wrong. They wait for the windfall to prove itself before they will believe in it. When the whole law runs the other direction, the believing opens the window. The window does not open first and hand you the belief afterward. Now let me be clear about something before we go one step further. This is not a teaching about a ticket. It is not a teaching about a lucky number pulled from a drum. The lottery is simply the picture the mind reaches for when it tries to imagine a windfall arriving all at once, out of nowhere, undeserved and unearned. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is exactly how supply behaves when consciousness is ready for it. Sudden, whole, and seemingly out of nowhere, you have been taught that increase comes from luck, from timing, from a stranger's decision, and she taught something almost scandalous by comparison, that the increase already has your name written on it, in what she called the limitless supply, and it is not searching for a lucky number, it is searching for a ready consciousness. So if you have been checking the outer world for proof, and finding none, hear this gently. You were checking the wrong window, and somewhere in you, your number has already been called. Before we walk through the signs together, let us plant one seed in words, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the spoken word is a creative power. A decree spoken in faith moves the very things it names. So say it with me. I am the child of a limitless giver. The windows of heaven are already open above me, and my word is my wand. Again, I am the child of a limitless giver. The windows of heaven are already open above me, and my word is my wand. And if something in you just went quiet and warm when you said that, type the 2 words God supplies in the comments below. Right now, before you watch another moment, let it be your seal on this teaching. God supplies. The first key is the sign of a strange calm arriving before the money does. And I want you to notice this one first, because it is the quietest sign and yet the most reliable. When a woman named Ruth came to one of Florence Scovel Shinn's classes, she said she had been anxious about her rent for 3 straight months, staring at the calendar, staring at her bank balance, checking the mailbox with a knot in her stomach, lying awake running the same numbers over and over, as if repeating them enough times might change them. And then one Tuesday morning, nothing about her outer circumstances had changed at all. No letter had come, no call, no sign the outer world had shifted even slightly, and yet the anxiety simply lifted. She said it felt like someone had turned down a loud radio she had gotten so used to, she no longer noticed it was even playing. And only after the quiet arrived did she realize how long she had been living inside that noise. 3 days later, a check arrived that she had completely forgotten she was owed, and she told Florence Scovel Shinn that the strangest part of the whole story was not the check. It was that some part of her had already known, days before, that everything was already all right. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this calm is not a coincidence riding ahead of the miracle. It is the miracle's shadow, falling backward across time, because consciousness always arrives before its evidence. The inner state is the substance, and the outer event is only the shadow it casts afterward. And here is a small everyday picture of the very same thing. Think of a woman standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, coffee in hand, staring at a stack of bills on the counter she has stared at every morning for weeks. And then one ordinary morning, nothing different about the light, nothing different about the stack itself. She simply feels lighter looking at it. The tightness in her chest that always came with that particular view of that particular counter is simply not there. She cannot explain why. And Florence Scovel Shinn would tell her not to try to explain it, only to trust it, because that lightness is not a mood, it is a message. It is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of a deeper feeling, finally strong enough to override the old one. So this week, notice your own static. Notice the specific worry that plays on repeat in your mind, at the same hour, in the same room, with the same familiar ache, and when you catch it quieting for even 10 minutes without cause, without a single outer thing having changed to explain it, do not brush past it. Do not tell yourself it is only a good mood or a lucky morning. Mark it. Thank it, because Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you, that peace which arrives before the proof is the proof. Dressed early, wearing borrowed clothes until the rest of the evidence catches up to it. And it is worth sitting with this a little longer, because so many people wait for calm to be the reward at the end of the story, when in her teaching, it is always the opening line, "It is not the money that produces the peace, it is the peace that clears the very channel the money will later travel through." The two are never in the order the anxious mind assumes, and if you have felt that strange lull lately and wondered what it meant, brushed it aside as simply a good day, or worried that you were only fooling yourself into a false comfort, wonder no longer, and worry no longer either. Your number has already been called somewhere behind that quiet, and it is only waiting for you to stop bracing against it and start walking through it. I bless this calm. It is proof my good is already on its way. The second key is the sign that you stop counting other people's blessings as evidence against your own. This one arrives quieter still, and most people never notice when it happens, because it does not announce itself with fireworks. It simply shows up one ordinary afternoon as the absence of a sting that used to be there without fail. There was a man in one of Florence Scovel Shinn's talks, a salesman named Walter, who used to open the newspaper and feel a small private ache every time he read about someone else's promotion, someone else's inheritance, someone else's lucky break. He told her that every good thing that happened to another person felt like a good thing subtracted from his own pile, as if supply were a single pie being cut into fewer and fewer pieces, and the fewer pieces left, the smaller his own share must surely become. And she told him plainly, that is not how supply behaves at all. Supply is not a pie. It is a river, and a river does not run dry, because your neighbor filled his cup from it. In fact, the very evidence that the river is flowing at all should fill you with more faith, not less, because if it reached him, the channel is open, and an open channel does not close itself off from the very next person standing beside it. So she gave him a small practice. Whenever he read of another person's windfall, he was to say quietly to himself, "If it happened for them, it can happen for me." The river has not stopped moving. And Walter said within weeks the ache was gone. And something stranger happened too. He began to feel a kind of joy, watching other people receive. A joy that used to be laced with envy, and was now simply clean. And it was only a few months after that his own increase arrived, larger than he had asked for. Now let us slow down and look at why this sign carries so much weight. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that envy is a locked door, and generosity of spirit is the key that turns in that very lock. But she also taught something even more searching underneath that. She taught that whatever you begrudge in another, you silently declare to be scarce. And whatever you declare to be scarce, your own consciousness accepts as the law of your own life as well. So when Walter flinched at another man's promotion, he was not simply having an uncharitable moment, he was issuing a quiet decree. Promotions are rare, and rare things do not come to me. And that decree, spoken so softly he never even noticed he was speaking it, was doing more to keep his own good at bay than any outer circumstance ever could. This is why she insisted that rejoicing at another's good fortune is not merely good manners, it is not simply the polite thing to feel, it is active spiritual work. It is you standing at the same river with your own cup finally uncurled and open instead of clenched shut in comparison. Let me give you an ordinary picture of how this plays out, because it rarely looks dramatic. It looks like scrolling past a friend's announcement of a new house and feeling your chest tighten just slightly before you even realize why. It looks like hearing a coworker got the raise you quietly wanted and finding your congratulations come out a half-second too late and a half-degree too thin. None of this makes you a bad person. Florence Scovel Shinn would say, It simply makes you a person still standing at the old locked door, not yet aware there was a key in your pocket the whole time. So pause for a moment and think of one person whose recent good fortune has quietly stung you, just one, and silently bless it. Silently say, "The same river, the same source, is running toward me even now." And notice what happens in your own body when you say it. Because the moment you can genuinely rejoice at another's increase without a flinch, you have removed one more stone from your own gate. And here is what makes this sign so trustworthy. It never shows up by accident. It only shows up once something in your own consciousness has already begun to loosen its grip on scarcity, which means if you have caught yourself lately feeling glad for someone else's windfall instead of small beside it, that gladness was not sentimental, it was structural. It was the tightness in your own believing finally letting go. It is not that other people's blessings threaten yours. It is that other people's blessings are proof the river is running. And a river that is proven to run does not skip the very next cup held out to receive it. I rejoice at every blessing I see, for the same river flows to me. The third key is the sign that small doors start opening before the big one ever swings wide. And this is the one Florence Scovel Shinn spoke of most tenderly. Because it is so easily missed, people wait for the grand announcement, the enormous check, the single dramatic moment, and while they wait for that, they walk right past the small opening doors that were the actual proof the big one was coming. A woman named Alice told her once that in the weeks before an unexpected sum arrived, 3 small strange conveniences had lined up in a row. A parking space opened right in front of the building she needed on a day she was running late. A bill she thought was due arrived a full week later than expected, giving her breathing room she did not ask for. And a stranger in a shop handed her the exact item she had been quietly wishing for at a steep discount without her saying a word about it. None of these were the windfall itself, but Florence Scovel Shinn taught that they were its outriders, the small couriers sent ahead to say the main event is on its way. She called this the law of visible ease, when your outer life begins loosening its small knots without your straining. That is the surest sign your consciousness has already opened the larger channel. It is not that the small conveniences are unimportant next to the big one. It is that the big one was never going to come without the small ones first, because supply always tests the channel with a trickle before it trusts it with a flood. And there was another student, a young man named Peter, who came to her quite discouraged, certain that nothing was moving in his life at all, and she asked him a simple question, not what has arrived, but what has eased. And when he thought about it honestly, he realized that a long-standing tension with a landlord had softened without explanation. A machine at his work that used to break constantly had suddenly been running smoothly, and a small errand that always took him an hour had somehow taken 10 minutes that very week. He had been so fixed on the absence of the large event that he had completely overlooked the presence of these smaller ones. And Florence Scovel Shinn told him gently that he had been standing in the doorway itself without noticing the door, because he was staring past it towards some larger frame he had decided the good must fill. This is precisely where so many sincere people lose heart. They set their eyes on one specific size of miracle and refuse to recognize its cousins, and so the trickle passes them by entirely unread, like a letter delivered to the right address but never opened. So let this be a gentle correction. The ease does not have to look like the ending you imagine. It does not need to announce itself. It will not arrive wearing a sign that says, "Here is your proof." It will simply feel lighter, smoother, quieter than usual. A line that used to be long moves quickly. A call that used to be difficult goes easily. A decision that used to be agonizing suddenly feels obvious. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that ease itself is a language. It is consciousness speaking in its own native tongue before the outer world has caught up enough to speak in numbers. So this week, keep a private list. Nothing dramatic, just the small eases, the found parking space, the returned call you did not expect, the little grace that saved you 10 minutes or $10. And when you notice 3 or 4 of these arriving in the same short stretch of days, let your heart quicken just slightly. not with anxious hope, but with quiet recognition, because Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you plainly, the trickle is not separate from the flood, the trickle is the flood, introducing itself politely before it arrives in full, and so the very smallness of the sign is exactly what makes it trustworthy. A counterfeit always needs to be loud to be believed, but the true movement of supply is content to whisper first, knowing the whisper is already doing its work. I welcome every small ease, for it announces the larger good behind it. The fourth key is the sign that your speech changes from begging to claiming. And I want to slow down here, because this is where the whole teaching turns from something you watch for into something you actually do. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the spoken word is never a neutral thing, it is a wand. Every sentence you speak about money is either building the window or boarding it shut. And most people speak about money the way a beggar speaks at a gate. Please let this work out. I hope this comes through. I need this so badly. And she taught that begging language, however sincere, holds the good at arm's length. Because begging is spoken from the state of lack, and lack can only reproduce more lack. Whatever state you speak from is the state your words go out and gather evidence for. It is not the mouth that decides what arrives. It is the state behind the mouth, and the mouth simply reports what that state already believes. First, consider what begging language sounds like in an ordinary week. A woman checking her account and whispering, "Please let there be enough." A man staring at bills and sighing, "I don't know how I'm going to manage." A mother saying under her breath, "I just hope something comes through soon." None of these people are foolish. They are simply speaking from the old identity, the one that believes itself at the mercy of supply rather than made of the same substance as supply. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this old identity has to be allowed to dissolve, gently, the way frost dissolves off a window in the morning sun. Not because the old self is shameful, but because it was never the true self to begin with. It was only a borrowed coat, worn for a season. And the moment you notice yourself speaking its language, that is not a moment for judgment. It is a moment for a simple substitution. Second, consider what claiming language sounds like instead. Not "please let there be enough," but "there is always enough." Not "I hope this comes through, but this is already arranged and on its way." Not "I don't know how I'll manage, but I am being carried." Supply always finds a way. And notice, claiming language is not denial of the outer facts. The bill is still on the table, but Florence Scovel Shinn taught that consciousness is the first cause and circumstance is only the effect. So speaking the claim is not pretending the effect is different. It is going straight to the cause and adjusting it there. The words are the doorway through which the state behind them finally steps into the open. And she taught that words are seeds, and a seed does not argue with the soil about whether it deserves to grow. It simply falls, and roots, and grows according to its own nature. So when you speak a sentence of lack, even in passing, you have dropped a seed of lack into the soil of your own life, and it will do what seeds do. It will grow, and when you speak a sentence of claim instead, however small it feels, that seed grows too. This is why she taught that idle words are never truly idle. There is no sentence about money that costs you nothing. Everyone is doing quiet work in the dark, whether you are watching it or not. Third, let me tell you about a woman named Dorothy, who came to Florence Scovel Shinn, burdened by a lifetime of small, worn phrases. She had said, "Money doesn't grow on trees" so many times, she said it without even noticing her own voice. She had said, "We can't afford that" to her children. So often, it had become a family song. Everyone hummed without thinking. And Florence Scovel Shinn asked her, "Do you hear what you are decreeing?" Dorothy had thought of her complaints as simply describing reality, and Florence Scovel Shinn told her gently that this is the trap. The old self always insists it is merely describing what is true, when in fact it is continually decreeing what will remain true. So Dorothy began a small practice. Every time the old phrase rose in her throat, she paused and replaced it. "Money doesn't grow on trees" became "money comes to me from expected and unexpected sources." "We can't afford that" became "we choose differently right now, and more is coming." And months later, She said the strangest part was not the money that eventually loosened, though it did. It was how much lighter her whole household felt, as if a tension that had lived in the walls for years had finally been given permission to leave. And there was another woman, a shopkeeper named Miriam, who greeted every customer with the same tired line. "Business is so slow this season," never noticing she was standing behind her own counter, decreeing emptiness into the very room she depended on to fill. And when this teaching reached her, she changed only her sentence. "Business is flourishing in its own good time," she began to say, even on the slowest afternoons, and within weeks, the words no longer felt forced. They felt simply true, and the shop, she said, began to feel warmer to stand in, before a single new customer had walked through the door. Fourth, consider an ordinary day, laid out hour by hour, so you can see where this sign hides inside your own life. In the morning, a bill notification appears, and the old habit says, "There it is again. When is this going to stop?" And the claiming habit, spoken quietly, says, "Thank you for this reminder that I am provided for." At midday, a co-worker mentions a promotion, and the old habit says, "Of course, must be nice." And the claiming habit says, "The same river that reached them is reaching me even now." In the afternoon, your savings look smaller than you would like, and the old habit says, "This is never going to be enough." And the claiming habit says this is a temporary picture, and not the final one. In the evening, paying for groceries, the old habit tightens the chest and says, "I hope this card goes through." And the claiming habit relaxes the shoulders and says, "Supply always meets me exactly where I stand." And later, lying awake, the old habit runs its quiet tally of everything owed. And the claiming habit interrupts kindly and says, "I release this day into the hands that never fail to provide." Nothing in the outer facts changed by force, but the entire emotional architecture of the day changed, hour by hour, sentence by sentence. And that architecture is exactly what consciousness is built from. It is not the size of the claim that matters most, it is the frequency of it. A small claim repeated all day outweighs one grand declaration spoken once and forgotten, which is why she urged her students to treat this not as a single performance, but as a quiet discipline, tended the way a person feeds a small fire a little at a time, all day, so it never goes out. And here is what makes this the fourth sign, rather than merely an exercise. When a person truly lives this way, others start to notice something different in how they speak about money. A friend may say, "You sound so calm about all this lately." And when someone else notices the shift in your language before your bank account has caught up, that is a sign, because your inner claiming has already become visible enough to be felt, which means it has already begun rearranging the outer picture behind the scenes. And there is one more layer worth naming, because the old begging self does not usually disappear all at once. It returns in disguise, dressed as caution, dressed as being realistic, whispering that claiming feels foolish when the bank balance says otherwise. And that is simply the old coat trying to be put back on once more. And you are not required to fight it, only to notice it, and set it down again, as many times as it returns. Because each time you set it down, the true self underneath stands a little more fully in its own light. So pause for a moment right now, and pick one real sentence you have caught yourself saying about money this past week. Just one. And quietly reword it into a claim. Not a hope, a claim. And speak it once, right now, in your own voice. Because the old self loosens its hold one sentence at a time, and the new self, the one supply has been waiting for all along, steps forward the very moment you give it your voice to speak with. My words no longer beg, they claim, and my claim is already answered. The fifth key is the sign that you stop designing the delivery route. And I want you to feel the weight of this one slowly, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that most people's prayers are really instructions given to the very power they claim to be trusting. They do not simply ask for the good, they specify exactly which truck it must arrive on, exactly which hour, exactly which person must be the one to hand it over. And then when the good tries to come by some other road entirely, they miss it completely because they were staring so hard down the one path they had decided was the only acceptable one. A young man once told her he needed money desperately and had been praying only that a particular business deal would close. When the deal fell through, he was devastated, certain his prayer had failed him, and only weeks later did he realize that in that very same window of time, an old debt he had forgotten about entirely was quietly repaid to him from a completely different direction. The supply had arrived, right on schedule, just not through the door he had nailed shut with his own detailed instructions. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is one of the gentlest tricks the limitless supply plays on a struggling mind. It insists on coming exactly when it is needed, but it will not be bullied into coming exactly how the mind demands. Consider a woman named Grace, who prayed faithfully every night for a raise at her job, certain that was the only door through which her increase could ever walk. And week after week she watched that particular door stay shut, growing more anxious each time her employer passed her over. And it was only when she finally exhausted herself of gripping that single outcome, when she said, quietly and almost in surrender, "I no longer care which way it comes, I only trust that it comes," that a distant cousin she had not spoken to in years left her a small inheritance that dwarfed the raise she had been begging for. Florence Scovel Shinn would say, Grace had not been denied. She had simply been standing at the wrong window with her eyes fixed shut against every other one. So this fifth sign asks something quiet of you. Notice this week, whenever you catch yourself insisting the good must come from this one job, this one person, this one deal, and gently loosen your grip there, not because the specific hope is wrong, but because the specific route is never yours to dictate. The river does not consult the mind for directions. It simply knows where the sea is, and when you feel yourself no longer gripping the exact how, no longer needing it to be this door or that hand, and instead feeling a loose, open confidence that it will arrive, somehow, through whichever door proves easiest for it, that loosening is not carelessness. It is trust finally maturing into wisdom. And if you have caught yourself lately saying something as simple as, "I do not know how this is going to work out, but I know that it will," treasure that sentence, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught, it is one of the most reliable signs there is that the map has already been released into hands wiser than your own. I release the how, and I trust the way that is already arranged. The sixth key is the sign that old debts and old fears begin to loosen their grip, and this is a deeper sign than it first appears, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that fear is simply faith turned upside down. It is belief pointed at the wrong outcome. And every dollar of debt, or every worry about lack, carries an emotional charge that has to discharge before the new supply has anywhere clean to land. Think of fear the way you would think of a fist, clenched so long the fingers forget they were ever meant to open. The money cannot be placed into a hand like that, not because the universe is withholding it, but because the hand itself has no room left to receive. So before the windfall can arrive in the outer world, something has to happen first in the inner one. The grip has to loosen, quietly, often without your even noticing it is happening. There was a man named Thomas who carried an old debt for nearly 6 years, and every single night before sleep he would run the number in his head, over and over, until it sat on his chest like a stone he carried to bed with him. And then one ordinary Sunday, for no outer reason at all, he noticed the number simply was not there when he lay down. He actually sat up, startled, checking his own mind the way you might check a pocket for keys. And Florence Scovel Shinn told him gently that he had not forgotten anything. He had finally set it down. And the setting down was not a symptom of the debt being handled. It was the first quiet motion of the debt actually being handled. Weeks before the outer resolution arrived, so many people wait for the relief to follow the resolution, when she taught it plainly the other way around. The relief is not the reward for the debt being cleared. The relief is the clearing, already underway, working outward the way warmth spreads through a cold room, long before you can see any single object visibly change. Now consider this from a second angle. Because fear rarely announces itself as fear, it disguises itself as caution, as simply being realistic. A woman checking her balance 5 times a day does not think of herself as afraid. She thinks of herself as careful, and yet this compulsive checking is itself the fear speaking, dressed in a very respectable coat. So this week notice not only the obvious fears, but the quiet compulsive ones, the checking, the rechecking, the mental replaying of a number, and when you catch yourself in it, do not scold yourself. Simply notice how tightly wound it is, because that tightness is the very thing that has to soften before the channel opens. And consider a third angle still, because sometimes what loosens first has nothing to do with money directly at all. Sometimes it is an old grudge, a resentment carried for years towards someone tangled up with money in your past, a parent who mishandled it, a partner who mismanaged it, a boss who withheld what was owed. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that resentment is one of the tightest knots consciousness can tie around its own supply, tighter even than fear itself, because fear at least admits it wants something. Resentment simply refuses to let the old wound close. So if forgiveness toward that person rises up in you unbidden lately, quietly, almost without your permission, treat that softening as one of this sign's truest cousins, because the untying of that particular knot frees channels you did not even know were connected to your supply. This is why she would sometimes tell a student, praying only about money, to instead go and forgive a person from years ago they had never once mentioned, because she could see the knot was tied there, not in the ledger at all. Let me give you a second small story, because fear does not always look like a debt or a grudge. Sometimes it looks like a drawer. There was a woman named Marion who kept every unpaid bill she had ever received in a single drawer in her kitchen, unopened, stacked one on top of another. Because looking at them made her stomach turn, she even moved her coffee cups to the other side of the counter just to avoid standing near it each morning. And Florence Scovel Shinn asked her a simple question. What do you suppose you are keeping alive in that drawer? And Marion had no answer at first, but months later, after she had finally opened the drawer, sorted what needed sorting, paid what could be paid, and let go of what could not yet be resolved, she said the whole kitchen felt different, lighter, as though a low hum she had lived with for years had simply switched off. And it was only after that quiet switching off that an old client finally settled an account owed to her for a very long time. The drawer was never really about the paper inside it. It was a small shrine Marion had built to her own fear, tended daily, fed by avoidance, and the moment she stopped feeding it, the fear had nowhere left to live, and a fear with nowhere left to live simply leaves. So here is a small practice to carry this key honestly into your week. Each night, for just a few quiet minutes, notice whatever fear or old grudge surfaces most easily in your mind, and instead of pushing it away, simply say to it, "You may go now. I release you, and I let the debt go with you." And then let your body actually soften. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench, because the body often knows the release before the mind fully believes it. And if you notice, even for one single night, that the old fear does not come, that the 3 in the morning tightness does not arrive, that the bill sits on the table without your stomach dropping the way it once did, do not call that an ordinary good day. It is a door swinging quietly open in a hallway you have not yet had the courage to walk down, and the debt whose grip is loosening tonight is only the visible edge of a much larger loosening already moving through you, one that reaches further than you can presently see, and touches doors you have not even noticed are locked. I release every old fear, and I let it take the debt with it as it goes. The 7th key is the sign that a sudden generosity rises up in you before the increase even lands. And I want to unfold this one slowly, in several pieces, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that of every sign on this list, this is the one most consistently reported by people right before a windfall, and yet it is the one almost no one expects, and almost no one trusts when it arrives. First, consider what this actually looks like in an ordinary week. You are not wealthy yet. Nothing dramatic has arrived. The account still shows what it showed yesterday, and yet you find yourself wanting to pay for a stranger's coffee, wanting to slip an extra bill into a tip, wanting to give more generously at a moment when logic would say, hold tight, guard what you have, count every dollar twice. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this rising generosity is never foolishness. It is never carelessness wearing a kind face. It is the truest possible evidence that your consciousness has already tasted its own abundance ahead of your bank statement. Because a person who genuinely believes themselves poor clutches, the hand curls into a fist without being told to, and a person who has begun to feel, even faintly, the truth of their own limitless supply opens their hand before they have even decided to. The hand opens before the proof arrives, because the hand was never waiting on the proof to begin with. It was only ever waiting on the belief. It is not the money that loosens the hand. It is the loosened hand that the money is already moving toward, and it is worth pausing on that reversal a moment longer, because almost everyone alive has been taught the exact opposite order. They were taught, wait until you can afford it, wait until you have some to spare, wait until the number is comfortable, and only then will generosity be safe. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this waiting is precisely what keeps so many sincere people standing outside a door that would open the instant they reached for it. It is not safety that produces generosity. It is generosity, however small, that produces the very safety the mind was waiting to feel. Second, consider the story of a man named Harold, who came to one of her lectures deeply in debt, behind on payments he did not know how to catch up on, and yet in the very week before an unexpected sum arrived to clear that debt entirely, he found himself, almost against his own better judgment, buying a coat for a man he saw shivering outside a shop window on a cold evening. He told her afterward that it made no sense at all. He could barely cover his own rent that month. He had walked past that same corner a dozen times before without a second thought, and yet on this particular evening, something in him simply moved before his mind could talk him out of it. And giving that coat away felt like the most natural thing he had done in years. Not a strain, not a sacrifice, not even really a decision, simply an overflow. And Florence Scovel Shinn told him afterward that he had misunderstood his own gesture entirely. He thought he had given from scarcity and taken a foolish risk with money he did not have to spare, but in truth he had given from a place inside himself that already knew it was rich, a place his outer circumstances had not yet caught up to, and that knowing, however brief, however small the gesture looked from the outside, was the exact crack through which the larger supply then poured only days later, because giving from true generosity, not strain, not obligation, not the desperate hope of some cosmic reward waiting on the other side of the ledger, but simple, honest overflow, is one of the most powerful acts of faith a person can perform. It says with the body what the mouth may not yet fully believe, that there is more than enough. And it says it before a single outer fact has changed to justify saying it. Third, consider a second small story, because one story alone can feel like an exception rather than a law. A woman named Edith once told Florence Scovel Shinn that on the very morning before a long overdue payment finally reached her, she had felt a strange pull to leave a large tip for a young waiter who seemed exhausted and discouraged, far more than the meal called for, far more than her own budget that week comfortably allowed, and she said she almost put the bill back in her purse twice, telling herself it was impractical, and then left it anyway, because something in her simply wanted to, not from guilt, not from performance, but from a kind of quiet fullness she could not entirely explain. And when the payment arrived 2 days later, she said she understood immediately what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she taught that the outer world is only ever a mirror catching up to the inner one. The tip did not earn the payment. The tip and the payment were both effects of the very same cause. A consciousness that had, if only for a moment, remembered its own richness. And this is worth naming plainly. It is not the giving that causes the receiving, as though heaven kept a ledger of good deeds owed and paid. It is that the giving and the receiving are two branches of the very same root, and a root that has begun to feed one branch has already begun feeding the other, whether the eye can see it yet or not. Fourth, consider why this works the way it does at the deepest level. And here Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching goes to its very root. She taught that the universe, or what she called the divine mind, mirrors back to us the exact state we hold. If we hold tightness, we receive a tightened world. If we hold a genuine, unforced generosity, we receive a world that answers in kind. And this is not a transaction. It is not a bribe paid to heaven in exchange for a favor. That would only be a subtler form of begging, dressed up in the costume of giving, still whispering please underneath its generosity, still counting what it expects in return. The giving this sign describes has no calculation in it at all. It does not think about what it will get back. It simply moves because something true in you has already remembered what it actually is. And this is precisely why it functions as such a reliable sign rather than a technique you could fake your way into. Because a person cannot manufacture this kind of giving on command the way you might force a smile for a photograph. You cannot sit down and decide, today I will feel a spontaneous overflow. The very trying would prove its absence. Which means when it arises in you unbidden, quietly surprising even yourself, catching you a little off guard in the middle of an ordinary errand, it did not come from your effort. It came from a shift that already occurred underneath your effort, down in the deeper waters of your consciousness, where the real decisions are made, long before they surface, and that shift is precisely the one that precedes an increase. It is not the giving that causes the receiving, as though heaven were keeping a ledger of good deeds. It is that both the giving and the receiving are two branches growing from the very same root, and when one branch is already blossoming, you can be certain the other is not far behind. Fifth, let me walk you through an ordinary day, hour by hour, so you can see exactly how quietly this sign hides inside a life that looks, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. In the early morning, standing in line for coffee, a thought passes through you to cover the order of the stranger behind you, and the old habit says, do not be silly, you have your own bills to think about, and yet, something softer in you goes ahead and does it anyway. And you walk out feeling strangely light, as though you were the one who had been given something rather than the one who gave it. At midday, a co-worker mentions they are short for lunch, and instead of the usual quick calculation of what you can spare, you find yourself offering without even finishing the thought, and it costs you almost nothing to notice how easily it came. In the afternoon, an email arrives asking for a small donation to a cause you barely know, and where you once would have scrolled past without a second thought. You feel a small, unmistakable pull to give, not because you are trying to prove anything to yourself or to heaven, but because something in you simply wants to say yes. In the evening, you find a few dollars in a coat pocket you had forgotten about, and instead of quietly folding it into your own wallet the way you might have done a year ago, you find yourself wanting to pass it along to someone who needs it more, and later that same night, reflecting on the day, you realize you gave 4 separate times without a single one of them feeling like a sacrifice. And Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you plainly that a day shaped like that one is never an ordinary day at all. It is a day in which the inner state has already begun paying itself forward long before the outer account shows a single sign of it. And if you can find even one day like that in your own recent memory, one day when giving simply flowed instead of straining, treasure it, because that day was doing far more work in your favor than you were able to see at the time. Sixth, and this distinction matters more than it may first appear, because not all giving carries the same weight. There is the giving that comes from guilt, the giving that comes from obligation, the giving that comes from wanting to be seen as generous. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this kind of giving, however outwardly identical it may look, does not carry the same creative power at all, because underneath it, the state remains fear, fear of judgment, fear of appearing small, fear of not measuring up, and a gift given from fear still plants fear in the very consciousness that gave it, no matter how generous the gesture looks on the surface. So pause for a moment and consider one recent time you gave something, and ask honestly, did it come from an exhale or from a squeeze? Did it come from fullness or from the fear of looking empty? This is not a question meant to shame you, it is only meant to help you recognize the difference the next time the impulse rises, because the 7th sign is speaking specifically of the giving that comes from an exhale, the giving that surprises you with its own ease, the giving you almost cannot explain afterward, except to say it simply felt right. And when you learn to tell that giving apart from the anxious kind, you gain the ability to recognize this sign the very moment it appears in your own life, rather than months later in hindsight. So this week, without any pressure, and without turning this into another quiet transaction with heaven, simply notice, has there been a small impulse in you lately to give more freely than circumstances would seem to justify? Has a stranger's need moved you more than it used to? Has money that passed through your hands lately felt lighter, easier to release than it once did? Has generosity started to feel less like a sacrifice and more like an exhale? If so, do not talk yourself out of it as impractical, and do not shrink it down into something small and private and forgettable. Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you plainly that this is one of the loudest signals available that your number has already been called. The coat was never really given to the stranger, and the tip was never really left for the waiter. The coat and the tip were the receipts for a supply that was already arranged behind the scenes. And I want to give you one small practice to carry this key with you. Honestly, this week, find one small moment to give something. Not out of guilt, not out of strategy, not to test whether the law will reward you for it. Just a genuine small overflow. A coffee, a kind word backed by a few dollars, a little extra where extra is not required of you. And afterward, notice carefully how it felt in your body. If it felt like loss, like a tightening, like a small ache of regret, that is simply information. Gently return to the earlier keys and let the fear loosen further before you try again. But if it felt like lightness, like something in you exhaling, like a door swinging open rather than closing, treasure that feeling and remember it, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this exact lightness is the truest currency there is, long before any dollar changes hands, and it always precedes the heavier one. It is not the size of the gift that announces the sign, it is the ease inside it, and the smaller the strain behind a gift, the larger the truth it is quietly revealing about the supply already gathering just behind it. My hand opens freely, for I already know I have more than enough to give. The eighth key is the sign that you feel called to give before the windfall shows itself in any outer form at all. And I want to draw a careful line between this key and the one just before it, because they are cousins but not twins. The seventh key was a spontaneous generosity toward whoever crosses your path, a stranger, a passerby. But the eighth key is quieter and more specific. It is a distinct inner nudge toward one particular person, one particular gift, arriving with a strange sense of timing attached to it, almost like an appointment written on your heart before it is written anywhere else. First, consider what this nudge feels like in an ordinary life. It rarely arrives dressed as inspiration. It arrives almost apologetically. A name drifting into your mind while you wash the dishes. A small ache to send flowers to someone you have not spoken to in a year. An impulse to leave an envelope on a doorstep and say nothing about it. And because it seems inconvenient, because it arrives at the exact moment you feel you have least to spare, most people wave it away as sentimentality. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is exactly the mistake to guard against. Because the nudge was never sentimental. It was structural. It was consciousness moving ahead of the calendar to arrange its own delivery route. Second, consider the woman she described in her classes, who felt strongly, without any obvious reason, that she needed to send a small gift to a friend she had not spoken to in over a year. She almost talked herself out of it. She barely had enough to spare that month. And yet the nudge persisted so quietly and so insistently across several days that she finally obeyed it, simply to quiet her own mind. And less than 2 weeks later, that same friend, moved by the unexpected kindness, connected her to an opportunity that changed her financial circumstances entirely. And Florence Scovel Shinn wanted her students to see clearly that this was no lucky coincidence and no mechanical reward for a good deed. The very consciousness already preparing the opportunity on one side was simultaneously prompting the aligned action on the other. The nudge to give was never separate from the windfall that followed it. The nudge was the windfall's own advance messenger, moving through her as a small, persistent thought. Third, this sign asks something more active of you than almost any other on this list, because it does not simply ask you to notice a feeling, it asks you to obey one. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that consciousness communicates constantly in this hushed, unglamorous language. a name that surfaces for no clear reason, a pull toward a phone call you keep putting off, an impulse to set money aside for someone before you have any evidence they need it. And most people miss these messages because they are listening for something louder, a voice from the sky, a burning sign, when the whisper is the very medium the deeper supply most often chooses. Fourth, let me widen this with a longer story, because this sign so often gets lost among louder ones. There was a man named Arthur who told Florence Scovel Shinn that for 2 full weeks, the face of an old friend kept surfacing in his mind, at strange hours, not at any dramatic moment, simply while tying his shoes or waiting for a kettle to boil. And each time, a small specific figure came with the thought, a sum exactly enough to cover what he guessed might be a difficulty. And he argued with himself the entire 2 weeks, telling himself he was imagining a problem that did not exist, telling himself he could not afford to give away a sum like that while his own affairs were tight, and yet the thought would not release him. It returned at the kettle, it returned tying the shoes, it returned once even in the middle of a meeting where it had no business appearing. And when he finally called to simply check on his friend, he learned the man had been quietly struggling with almost that exact figure, and Arthur sent it that same afternoon, and Florence Scovel Shinn told him afterward that the 2 weeks of resistance cost him nothing eternal, because the timing was never really about the calendar date it finally happened on. It was about whether he obeyed at all, and once he obeyed, his own finances, which had felt tight and watched for weeks, loosened within days in a manner with no direct connection to the friend at all, a separate small sum arriving from an entirely unrelated source, and he said it felt less like a reward and more like a door, quietly ajar the whole time, finally allowed to swing open. Fifth, give this some texture the way an ordinary week might hold it. On a Monday, a co-worker's name crosses your mind twice for no reason you can name. By Wednesday, you still have not acted on it. By Friday, it returns a third time while you are standing in line somewhere, and this is usually the moment people explain it away, calling it nothing, imagining meaning where there is none. But Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you gently that a thought insisting on returning 3 times in 1 week has already stopped being random. It has become a message, and the old self always calculates first and obeys second if it obeys at all, while the true self obeys first and lets the calculating happen afterward, quietly, almost as an afterthought. So pause for a moment and ask honestly, has a name or a small act surfaced in your own mind more than once lately? Something you keep setting aside as impractical? If so, this key is speaking directly to you, and here is the exercise to carry into your week. When a nudge like this returns a second or third time, do not wait for it to make perfect financial sense. Do something small in its direction, a card, a message, a modest gift, an offered hour of your time. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that obedience to a small nudge is one of the highest forms of faith available to a person. It says, I trust this leading even before I can see where it is taking me. And that trust is precisely the currency the larger supply moves on. It is not the size of the gift that matters. A small gift obeyed carries more power than a large one calculated, because it proves you have begun to trust the whisper over the noise. And here is the door this key swings open into the one still ahead, because once you begin acting on these nudges consistently, something remarkable happens to your relationship with waiting itself. The anxious checking begins to fall away entirely, replaced by something steadier, and that quiet change, subtle as it is the final sign of all as avad. I obey the quiet nudge, and I trust where it is already leading me. The 9th key is the sign that a quiet certainty replaces the anxious watching, and this is the gentlest sign of them all, the one that arrives last, because it is really the summit of every sign that came before it. There is a small story Florence Scovel Shinn liked to tell, of a woman who had spent months checking her mailbox every day, with a tight, hopeful dread, opening the little metal door and finding it empty, and closing it again with the same small ache. And then one ordinary morning, she realized she had simply stopped checking, not because she had given up, but because she no longer needed the letter to arrive in order to feel that everything was already all right. And the letter came that very week, as if it had been waiting only for her to stop watching the door so anxiously. And I want you to notice how ordinary her days looked on the outside. The mailbox was the same, the street was the same, and yet Florence Scovel Shinn taught that everything that mattered had already changed somewhere else entirely. In the quiet room behind her own thoughts, long before the outer world had any evidence to offer. So many people picture faith as a tense hopefulness, a hand cupped anxiously around a small flame, terrified the wind will take it. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is not faith at all. It is fear wearing faith's clothing. True faith knows the flame was never in danger to begin with, so it opens its hand and lets the flame burn in the open air, undisturbed. This is why the ninth sign can look, from the outside, almost like indifference. A friend might say, "Are you not worried about this?" And you may find yourself surprised to answer honestly that you are not. Not because you have stopped caring, but because caring and anxious watching were never actually the same thing. You can care about your good arriving and still rest completely while it makes its way to you, the way a woman planting a garden cares deeply about the harvest and yet does not dig the seed back up every evening to check if it is growing. Consider your own phone for a moment. How many times a day have you opened a banking app in the last month, refreshed a screen, watching for the one notification that would finally prove your good was real? And now consider what it might feel like to simply set the phone down. Not from despair, but because something steadier has already told you what you needed to know. That shift, small as it looks, is enormous on the inside. Because the last thread connecting your peace to the outer world has quietly been cut. And your peace now stands on its own, needing nothing outside itself to hold it up. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this final sign is the truest resting place of faith. It is not indifference, and it is not resignation. It is the settled knowing that the outer proof is simply running a little behind the inner truth. The way thunder always runs a little behind the lightning that caused it. The lightning has already struck long before the sound ever reaches your ears, and so it is with your good. It has already been decided in consciousness long before your eyes are given anything to see. So when you find yourself no longer straining toward the outcome, no longer needing to check and recheck, and yet somehow more certain than ever that the good is already yours, that is not you giving up. That is you finally arriving at the very state every other sign has been quietly building you toward. All the way back to the first key. The strange calm that arrived before the money did was only the first faint note of this same certainty, and now it has grown into the whole song. Your number has already been called, and this final sign is simply your own heart finally hearing it clearly, no longer through the noise of watching, but in the stillness that comes after all the watching has finally, gently, let go. I rest in quiet certainty, for my good is already settled and on its way. Here is the whole picture. It is not luck knocking on your door. It is consciousness that was already open answering when it comes. It is not the calm that follows the money. It is the calm that clears the road the money travels on. It is not other people's blessings taking anything from your own supply. It is the same river proving that it still runs. It is not the big miracle you must wait for silently. It is the small eases already arriving as its outriders. It is not begging that moves heaven. It is claiming, spoken plainly in your own voice. It is not gripping the exact how. It is releasing the map and trusting the sea. It is not the fear that must be fought. It is the fear that is simply allowed to loosen and fall away on its own. It is not generosity given for a reward. It is generosity that proves the reward was already true. It is not a windfall waiting for your obedience as payment. It is a nudge that was always its own advance messenger. And it is not anxious watching that finally brings the good home. It is quiet certainty that reveals it was already there. 9 signs, and yet only one true key beneath them all. The moment your inner state changes, the outer world simply catches up to tell you what already happened. If this teaching has stirred something true in you, I want to personally invite you into the Overflow Covenant. It is a gentle, guided path, built on these very principles, where each week you are given a new decree, a new practice, a new way of tending your consciousness, so that supply becomes your normal and not your exception. It was priced modestly, at $37, so that no sincere seeker would ever be kept out by the price of the door. And it carries a full 30-day money-back guarantee, because this is offered in faith, and it is meant to be received in faith. You will find the link in the description below this video, and I would be honored to walk this road beside you. Say it with me, one final time, in your own heart if you cannot say it aloud. I am the child of a limitless giver. The windows of heaven are already open above me, and my word is my wand. Your number has already been called, and every sign along the way has simply been asking you, gently, again and again, to believe it before you see it. So go quietly now, and watch what begins to arrive.
Get on God's payroll. It never misses a Friday. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the same faithful hand which feeds the sparrow keeps a ledger with your name already written into it, long before you ever learn to doubt your own worth. There is a quiet promise tucked into the story of Noah. After the flood, after the old world had been washed clean away, and God speaks a line that most people read as a poem about farming, but Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you is really a payroll clause written into the very structure of creation. It is Genesis, chapter 8, verse 22, and it reads, "While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease." And she would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? This is not sentiment. This is law. Seed time and harvest do not negotiate. They do not check your bank balance first. They do not wait to see if you deserve the sunrise before they release it. The sun does not miss a morning, and the seasons do not miss a turn. And yet most of you have quietly assumed your own paycheck works on a different, shakier system, that it depends on your boss's mood, on the economy, on whether you were good enough this quarter. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say that very assumption is the one thing standing between you and a supply that has never once actually failed. You have been applying to man for a position that Spirit assigned you long ago, and the moment you understand that, the entire picture rearranges itself in your favor. Say it with me. I am on God's payroll. My wages are already prepared. My word is my wand again. I am on God's payroll. My wages are already prepared. My word is my wand. If something in you just went quiet hearing that, if some tired, striving part of you finally exhaled, then type the two words, God's payroll, in the comments below right now. Let it be your seal. The first key is to see yourself as already on the payroll of the universe, not as an applicant standing at the door with a resume in hand, hoping to be chosen, hoping to be enough, hoping the interviewer called circumstance looks kindly on you today. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this kind of hoping is exhausting work and also entirely unnecessary, because the position was never up for grabs in the first place. It was assigned to you the moment breath entered your body. Your name was entered into the ledger of divine supply, long before you ever learned to doubt it. And if you have spent years feeling like you were forever interviewing for a life that never quite hired you back, you are not the only one. So many quietly carry that exact exhaustion and call it simply being responsible. Think of the man who works faithfully for a company for 20 years and one day discovers there has been a pension fund quietly growing in his name the entire time. He did not have to create that fund through frantic striving. He only had to find out it was there and begin to claim it. And that is precisely the position you occupy right now. It is not that you must go out and convince the universe to pay you. It is that you must recognize the payroll already carries your name and begin drawing from it as though it were already so. Picture a woman who spends her mornings anxious, sorting through the mail, bracing herself for bills, scanning for lack before her coffee has even cooled. She does this so quietly, so automatically, that she has never once questioned whether it is even necessary. She simply calls it being careful with money. And then imagine that same woman waking one day and saying quietly to herself, I am already provided for. I am already on the payroll. Watch how her whole day rearranges around that one sentence. She walks into rooms differently. She speaks to her employer differently. She even opens her mailbox differently, because a person who knows they are already paid does not beg, they simply receive. Notice too how differently she sleeps that night, because a mind that has stopped applying for its own worth finally has permission to rest. This is the fastest shift available to you this very week. Stop applying and start receiving. When a bill crosses your desk today, do not brace against it. Instead, say under your breath, I am already provided for, and feel how differently that lands in the body than the old tightening around lack ever did. Notice the shoulders drop. Notice the breath deepen. Notice how the very same piece of paper suddenly carries less weight the instant your inner posture changes toward it. It is not applying that opens supply. It is recognizing the assignment already made. And once you rest in that recognition, even for a single moment, you have taken your very first true step onto payroll that never misses a Friday. This is not a technique you must master perfectly. It is simply a truth you must remember, the way you remember your own name, without effort, the moment someone asks it. Your place on this payroll requires no application, no interview, no proving, only your quiet return to what was true the whole time. And once you feel that shift beginning to settle in you, a larger question rises naturally. If the position was already given, then who exactly is issuing the check? I am already hired. I draw my wage without fear. The second key is to stop looking to man as your source of supply, and instead see man for what he truly is, a channel, never the fountain itself. Florence Scovel Shinn taught this so often because she watched so many people place their faith in the wrong office. They thought their supply lived in the boss's approval, or the client's mood, or the size of the company's budget this year. And when that channel narrowed even slightly, their whole sense of safety collapsed with it. But she would say, it is not your employer who pays you. It is not your customer who pays you. It is not even your own labor that pays you. These are simply the pipes through which the one true paymaster chooses, on any given day, to send your portion. And pipes can be changed. Pipes can be widened. Pipes can multiply. But the source behind them never runs dry. It is worth sitting with how deeply this one mistake shapes an entire life. A young man takes his very first job, and quietly, without ever saying it aloud, begins to worship the hand that signs his check. He studies his manager's moods the way sailors once studied the sky. He flinches when the office door closes a little too firmly. He lies awake, wondering if a passing comment in a meeting means his position is somehow at risk. And none of this fear is really about the words spoken in that meeting at all. It is about where he has secretly decided his supply lives. Florence Scovel Shinn would say gently, "You have built a shrine in the wrong room, and until you find the true altar, you will keep bowing to furniture." Consider the woman who worked for 15 years at a company she believed was her entire livelihood, and when it suddenly closed its doors, she felt as though the well itself had gone dry. She wept in her kitchen, certain that her whole world had ended with that final paycheck. But within months, she discovered work she loved even more, paying her even better, arriving through a friend she had not spoken to in years, through a conversation she never planned. And she said afterward, "I thought my supply left with that company, but I see now the company was only ever the doorway. The supply was never inside the building at all." This is the reframe Florence Scovel Shinn wanted every reader to hold close. It is not that man is unreliable, and therefore life is unreliable. It is that man was never the source to begin with, so his moods, his budgets, his decisions were never actually your ceiling. Your ceiling is only ever your own belief about where your paycheck originates. Picture two women receiving the very same unexpected pink slip on the very same afternoon. One collapses inward, certain her livelihood has ended, because in her private theology that company was the whole of her supply, and the other feels the sting, feels it honestly, but underneath the sting there is a steadiness, because somewhere along the way she came to understand this one office was never the fountain, only a single pipe, among many still connected to a source that was never threatened for even one moment. Watch which of these two women recovers first. Watch which one is already noticing new doors within the week, while the other is still staring at the closed one. This is not a difference in luck. It is a difference in where each woman had quietly placed her faith long before the notice ever arrived. So this week, when you feel your stomach tighten around a single client, a single employer, a single sale that did not close, pause and silently correct the thought, this is a channel, not the source. My paymaster has 1,000 other channels I have not even met yet. Say it plainly to yourself. Man is not my source. Spirit is my source. And man is simply one of its many generous hands. When you truly believe this, you stop clutching at any one channel so tightly that you choke it. You stop resenting the boss who was slow to notice you. You stop panicking over the one deal that fell through, because you know the payroll office itself was never in that room to begin with. It was never in that boardroom. It was never in that inbox. It has always been unseen and always been faithful. And once you release your grip on any single human channel, you make room for the next question naturally to rise. If the source is unseen, then how exactly do you place your claim upon it? Man is my channel. Spirit is my source. I release my grip in peace. The third key is to claim your wages in advance, speaking as one already paid, rather than one still waiting to be paid. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that most prayer and most desire is spoken from the wrong tense entirely. People say, I hope I will have enough. I need this deal to close. I wish supply would come. And she would gently correct every one of those sentences, because each one plants the seed of lack, even while trying to ask for abundance. The true claim is spoken as already accomplished. I am supplied. I am provided for. My needs are met. Think of a woman preparing for a dinner party who does not stand at her empty table, wondering if food might someday arrive. She sets the table first. She lays out the plates and the glasses in complete confidence that the meal is coming, because she has already ordered it and already trusts the delivery. This is exactly the posture Florence Scovel Shinn asks of you regarding your own supply. Set the table of your consciousness as though the check has already cleared. Consider a man who spent years praying the same worried prayer every single morning, standing at his kitchen counter saying, "Please let there be enough this month." And notice the posture hidden inside that sentence. It is the posture of a beggar at a locked gate, hoping someone inside might notice him, and month after month, the same tight feeling greeted him at his counter, because his own words kept confirming the very lack he feared. One day a friend suggested he try a different sentence. Not "please let there be enough," but "there is enough. My supply is already prepared," and he admitted it felt strange the first few mornings, almost like lying. But Florence Scovel Shinn would say, this is not lying at all. This is aligning your speech with a truth deeper than today's bank statement. The fact that divine supply already holds your portion, whether or not the evidence has caught up yet to announce it. Within weeks, this same man noticed his shoulders had stopped tightening at that counter. His voice had changed. Even his handwriting on the bills he paid felt calmer. Nothing outside him had moved yet, but everything inside him had already shifted into the tense of the already provided for. Speak your bills as already paid. Speak your rent as already covered. Speak your future as already provided for. Not because you are pretending falsely, but because you are aligning your inner speech with the actual truth of a payroll that never fails. This week, notice the tense you use when you speak about money. If you catch yourself saying, "I hope," gently exchange it for, "I am." If you catch yourself saying, "I need," gently exchange it for, "I have." This single habit, repeated daily, begins to shift the entire architecture of your expectation. It is not the waiting that draws supply closer. It is the claiming, spoken now, in the present, as already so. It is not begging that moves the hand of spirit. It is the quiet, settled certainty of one who has already been handed the check and is simply walking toward the bank to deposit it. And once you begin claiming rather than waiting, something interesting happens. The old fear naturally rises to challenge you. Some tired inner voice insists you cannot claim what you cannot yet see, and that voice is the very thing the next key must address directly. I speak my supply as present, not as promised. The fourth key is to let the old employee die, and understand clearly what that means. It does not mean any harm to you. It does not mean any punishment, any shame, any ending of the person you actually are. It means only that the false, frightened, underpaid version of yourself, the one who has been working overtime in fear for years, is finally released from a position it was never suited to hold, so that the true self, the one already secure, already provided for, already named on the payroll of the universe, can step forward and draw the wage that was always meant for it. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that most people are working two jobs at once without ever realizing it. There is the outer job, the one with the title and the paycheck and the manager, and there is the inner job, the one where an old identity clocks in every single day, convinced that supply is scarce, that competition is fierce, that there is never quite enough to go around, and this inner employee, this old anxious self, must be allowed to resign, must be allowed to be let go, so the true self can finally take the position it was hired for from the very beginning. First, consider how this old self got hired in the first place. Nobody chooses at 5 years old to believe in lack. It is handed to us. A parent's worried voice over unpaid bills, a childhood Christmas made smaller by circumstance, a teacher who says be realistic about your prospects, a relative who sighs that money does not grow on trees. And slowly, a young identity forms around scarcity, the way a plant grows around whatever trellis it is given. And that identity gets very good at its job. It becomes skilled at bracing, skilled at worrying, skilled at working twice as hard for half as much. It learns to apologize for wanting more. It learns to flinch at its own desires, and it wears that skill like a badge of honor, calling it responsibility, calling it realism, calling it simply being sensible. And here is the tender part. That self is not evil and does not deserve punishment. It was simply doing what it was trained to do, with great loyalty and great effort. But a trained employee, doing the wrong job for you, however sincere, however hard-working, still cannot deliver you what you are actually owed. Second, consider what it means for this self to be let go. In the outer world, letting an employee go feels like disaster, like failure, like an ending soaked in shame. But Florence Scovel Shinn would ask you to see it completely differently here. This is not being fired in disgrace. This is a retirement earned through simple recognition. You are not punishing the old self. You are thanking it and releasing it from a job it was never actually equipped to do well. Imagine an employee working diligently at the wrong desk for 30 years, filing the wrong forms, answering the wrong phone, exhausted every single evening, convinced this exhaustion is simply what work costs. And one day someone finally says, "This was never your desk. Come, let me show you where you actually belong." That is not cruelty. That is mercy. So when we speak of this old self dying, understand clearly, it means the false, frightened self dissolves, so the true, provided-for self can finally be free. Nothing about you that is real is ever destroyed. Only the borrowed costume is finally set down, and a costume, however long you wore it, was never your actual skin. Third, consider how this release actually happens in daily practice. It rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It happens in small, quiet resignations repeated until they become permanent. It is the moment you catch the old, anxious voice reaching for the calculator at midnight, and you gently say, "You are relieved of this duty now. Someone else has already handled it." It is the moment a bill arrives, and the old bracing reflex rises in your chest, and instead of following it, you breathe and say, "That employee no longer works here." It is the moment someone offers you a raise, a gift, an opportunity, and the old identity wants to shrink and say, "I do not deserve this." And you interrupt that voice mid-sentence and say, "Thank you for your years of service." You are released, and let the true self, the one already on the payroll, step forward instead to simply say thank you and receive. Pause for a moment right now and pick one real belief about money you inherited without ever choosing it. Notice how old it actually is. Notice whose voice first said it, and quietly tell that voice, with kindness, your shift has ended. Fourth, consider the fear that sometimes rises around this very idea. Some part of you may worry that releasing this old identity is dangerous, that its vigilance has somehow been protecting you all along, that without its constant bracing you might be caught unprepared. But Florence Scovel Shinn would gently ask you to notice something honest here. Has that old identity's fear ever actually produced your supply? Or has it only produced exhaustion while your supply, when it came through entirely different doors? The worry itself never once wrote a paycheck. It only ever stood guard over a door that was never the one your good was walking through anyway. Consider a woman who had spent years believing she was simply someone money did not come easily to. She called herself practical. She called herself careful. But underneath it was an old identity formed the year her family lost their home, and every dollar that came to her afterward was met immediately with dread instead of welcome, until one quiet afternoon she said aloud, alone in her kitchen, "The girl who learned to fear money may rest now. She has done her job long enough." And she described feeling almost lightheaded afterward, as though she had been carrying another person on her back for 20 years without noticing the weight until it finally set itself down. And consider too the man who spent decades believing that money only came through struggle, that ease was suspicious, that if something arrived easily, it must be a mistake soon to be corrected, until one day he said, out loud, alone in his car, "The version of me who believes in struggle is relieved of duty today." And he described afterward how strange and light he felt, as though an actual weight had lifted off his shoulders that had been there so long he had forgotten it was extra weight at all. This is what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she spoke of the old self dissolving, not death in the frightening sense, but death in the freeing sense. The false name stepping down so the true name, the one already inscribed on the payroll no one can revoke, can finally answer when it is called. So this week, notice where an old identity is still clocking in on your behalf. Notice the tired employee still bracing at your desk long after its usefulness has ended, and gently, without drama, without self-attack, thank it and release it. Say, "You may go now. I have been rehired under a truer name." And feel how the entire tone of your day changes the moment you do. Because once the false self has been released from its old post, the true self does not simply sit quietly in the empty office. It moves, it stands, it steps forward. It begins to expect its wages as naturally as it once expected disappointment. And that natural, quiet expectancy is precisely what the next key must teach you to sustain. The tired old self is released. The true self answers to my name. The fifth key is short, and it is meant to hit quickly. Show up daily. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that consciousness is built the same way muscle is built. Not through one dramatic effort, but through small, repeated acts of faith. An employee who shows up only when they feel inspired does not last long at any company. And the same is true of your own consciousness of supply. It must be shown up for daily, whether you feel like it or not. This does not mean striving. It means simply arriving each morning and quietly clocking in through gratitude. through a single spoken claim, through one moment of expectancy before the noise of the day begins. Consider a man who wanted very much to trust in his own supply, and who prayed beautifully about it, perhaps once a month, usually on the hardest night, usually with tears, usually meaning every word, and yet his life did not change. Because a single powerful prayer once a month is like an employee who shows up brilliantly for one shift and then vanishes for 30 days. No manager builds a business around that kind of worker, and no consciousness is built around that kind of faith either. It was only when he began showing up small, on ordinary mornings, nothing dramatic, simply a quiet 30 seconds before his feet touched the floor, that his whole life began to shift beneath him, not because that 30 seconds was more powerful than his tearful midnight prayers, but because it was repeated, and repetition is what consciousness actually answers to. Pause for a moment right now and pick one real thing in your life you have simply stopped expecting to improve. A bill you assume will always be tight, a raise you assume will never come, a door you quietly wrote off months ago, and today, gently, clock back in on that exact area. Whisper, I am on the payroll here too. This small daily act does more than any single dramatic prayer ever could, because it is not intensity that builds a consciousness of supply. It is consistency. A single generous thought spoken once and forgotten does little, but a single true thought spoken daily becomes a habit, and a habit becomes a character, and a character becomes a destiny. It is not the size of the claim that moves the universe. It is the steadiness of the claim, small and faithful, morning after morning, the way a single drop of water, falling in the same place day after day, eventually shapes even stone. So let this be simple. Let it be small. Let it take 30 seconds each morning before your feet even hit the floor. Say quietly, I show up today already on the payroll. And mean it, not loudly, not anxiously, just steadily. The way you would clock in for any job you actually trusted was real. And once this becomes daily practice, you will notice something curious start to happen around you. Appearances will occasionally try to hand you a notice suggesting your position has been revoked, and how you respond to that notice is the very next thing you must learn. I clock in with gratitude. I never miss my own shift. The sixth key is to refuse every layoff notice appearances try to hand you. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the outer world will constantly attempt to serve you documents suggesting your position has been terminated, a bank balance lower than expected, a client who goes silent, a diagnosis, a delay, a rejection letter, and each of these arrives dressed exactly like an official notice, complete with letterhead and deadline. But she would say plainly, it is not your job to accept every notice handed to you simply because it was handed to you. You are permitted, in fact you are required, to examine the signature at the bottom of that notice and ask, who exactly authorized this? Because appearances have no actual authority over the payroll of spirit. They only have the authority you personally sign over to them. It is not the notice itself that ever does the damage. It is the signature you add to it in fear. Without your signature, the paper is only paper. With your signature, it becomes, in your own experience, law. And this is precisely why two people can receive what looks like the identical bad news and live two entirely different weeks afterward. One signs immediately, almost out of habit, and the other holds the paper up to the light first. Let us walk through what an ordinary day looks like when this key is not yet understood, and then what it looks like once it is. In the version without this key, a woman wakes at 6, checks her phone first thing, sees a bank notification lower than she hoped, and immediately her whole nervous system signs for that layoff notice. By 7, she is short with her children. By 8, she is rehearsing worst-case scenarios in traffic. By 9, she opens her email at work already braced for bad news. And sure enough, she finds a curt message from a client and reads disaster into every line of it. By noon, she has skipped lunch because her stomach is in knots. By 3, a colleague mentions budget cuts in passing, and she spends the rest of the afternoon convinced she is next. By 6, she comes home exhausted, not from her actual workload, but from an entire day spent signing for notices that were never truly hers to accept. Now consider the same woman, same exact circumstances, having taken hold of this key, she wakes at 6, sees the same low balance, and instead of signing for it, she says quietly, "This is an appearance, not an authority. My true balance is held elsewhere." By 7, she is present with her children because her nervous system was never hijacked in the first place. By 9, she opens the same curt email from the same client, and instead of reading disaster, she reads simply, "information," and responds calmly. By 3, she hears the same mention of budget cuts, and instead of spiraling, she reminds herself, "My position was never issued by this company. It was issued by Spirit, and this company is only one of its many channels." By 6, she comes home with energy still in her, because she did not spend the day fighting appearances that were never real threats to begin with. Same day, same events, entirely different results, because one woman signed every notice handed to her and the other one simply refused delivery. Florence Scovel Shinn was always careful to clarify, this is not denial of facts. The low balance may be real, the curt email may be real, but their meaning, their authority over your future, is never automatically real. That meaning is something only you can assign, and you are always free to withhold it. It is not the appearance that decides your fate. It is the meaning you quietly stamp upon it before 9 in the morning. Consider also the man who receives an actual rejection letter after a job interview he had hoped for, and instead of treating it as a final verdict on his worth, he simply says, "This door was not mine to walk through. The payroll office has other doors already prepared." And within weeks, a different opportunity opens that he had not even considered. He would tell you afterward, the rejection letter was never the enemy. His own signature upon it, as proof of his unworthiness, was the only thing that ever could have slowed him down. So this week, when appearances hand you their pink slip, do not sign automatically out of old habit. Hold it up to the light first and ask, does this carry the true paymaster's signature? And when you see plainly that it does not, hand it back, refuse delivery, and keep working exactly as though your position remains exactly as secure as it has always truly been. Because once you have learnt to refuse false notices calmly and consistently, you are finally ready to understand the deeper mechanism underneath all of this, the actual nature of the payroll itself, why it moves the way it moves, why it never once has actually missed a Friday even in the moments it seemed to. I refuse every notice not signed by Spirit itself. The 7th key is the deepest one, and it deserves to be unfolded slowly, in pieces, because this is the very heart of the entire teaching, the actual nature of a payroll that never misses a Friday. First, consider the punctuality of universal law. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the same law which governs seed time and harvest, which governs sunrise and sunset, which governs the tide coming in and going back out on schedule, also governs supply, and law, by its very nature, does not run late. Tides do not apologize for being a few hours behind. The sun does not send word ahead that it might not make it today. These things are punctual because punctuality is simply what law means. And if supply is truly governed by law rather than by luck, then supply is punctual too. Whether or not the outer evidence has caught up yet to that punctuality in your particular case, this is worth sitting with slowly. Most people believe their payday is subject to chance, to mood, to circumstance. But Florence Scovel Shinn would say, your payday is subject to law, and law always keeps its appointment, even when the check arrives by a route you did not expect, even when the appointment itself is written in a handwriting you do not yet recognize as your own. A clock does not need your permission to keep correct time. It simply keeps it. And the payroll of Spirit is exactly this kind of clock. indifferent to your doubt, faithful regardless of whether you happen to be watching it closely that day. Second, consider the faithfulness hidden behind the timing. There is a difference between something arriving late and something merely arriving by a path you had not anticipated, and this difference is easiest to see through an ordinary story rather than a lofty one. Picture a man who does small carpentry jobs for a living, a fence here, a cabinet there, and one particular month, 3 separate clients are slow to pay him. The rent is due on the 28th, and by the 25th nothing has come in. He sits at his kitchen table that evening, with the bills spread out in front of him, like a hand of cards he did not choose. The old frightened self in him wants to call every client twice a day, wants to lie awake doing arithmetic in the dark, wants to refresh his banking app every hour, as though watching it might somehow speed the numbers along. But he has been practicing this teaching, so instead, he closes the app, sets the bills aside, and says quietly each morning before his feet touch the floor, "My payroll is punctual. I trust the hand behind the timing." And he goes about his ordinary days, sanding wood and measuring boards, as though nothing were wrong at all, because nothing, in truth, actually was. On the 26th, a neighbor he had almost forgotten waves him down in the driveway and asks if he could build a small shelf that same afternoon, an odd little job, nothing grand, and pays him in cash before he has even finished sanding the edges. That same evening, one of the 3 slow clients finally sends payment through an app he rarely checks, a notification he almost misses entirely because he was not staring at the screen waiting for it. And by the 28th, the rent is not only covered, but a little left over, enough for a treat he had quietly given up expecting that month. And he says afterward, "I thought I was 3 days from disaster. I did not realize I was actually 3 days from provision arriving through 2 doors I had not even been watching." This is precisely what Florence Scovel Shinn meant. The payroll was never late. It only looked late because he was staring at the one channel that happened to be running slow that month, while 2 other channels were already quietly in motion on his behalf. The check was already written. It was simply traveling by a road his eyes had not yet learned to watch. Third, consider trust as the actual mechanism by which this payroll operates. Not effort, not striving, not even hard work alone, though those things have their place, but trust, because trust is what keeps the channel open wide enough for the check to actually pass through. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that fear narrows the very channel supply needs to travel through. The way a pinched hose slows water no matter how much pressure is behind it. And trust widens that same channel. The water was always there. The pressure was always there. The only variable was ever the width of the opening. Go back to that same carpenter for a moment. And imagine a version of him who spent those final 3 days calling every client in a panic, snapping at his own children, refusing to answer his phone out of dread it might be another bill, checking his mailbox 4 times a day, and coming away emptier each time. Notice how that version of him would have missed the neighbor's knock entirely, would have been too tense, too distracted, too busy defending himself against an imagined disaster to even hear the actual provision arriving at his door. He might have waved the neighbor off, saying he was too busy, too worried, too behind on everything else to take on one more small job. And in doing so, he would have closed, with his own trembling hand, the very door his rent was waiting to walk through. This is the quiet danger of fear. It does not just feel unpleasant, it can make you deaf to the very channels already opening around you, while trust keeps you alert, calm, available to notice the shelf that needs building, the message that finally comes through, the door that was already unlocked the whole time. Trust is not passive. Trust is what keeps your eyes open in the right direction. Fourth, consider what it means that this payroll has never actually missed a Friday. Even in the moments in your own life when it seemed to, look back honestly for a moment at the hardest financial seasons you have lived through, the ones that felt, at the time, like proof the whole system had failed you. And ask yourself plainly, Did you actually starve? Did you actually end up on the street? Or did something, however small, however unexpected, however late it felt in the moment, eventually arrive? A friend's timely offer, a refund you forgot you were owed, a job that appeared right when the old one ended, an idea that turned into income you had not planned for, an envelope in the mail from someone who owed you nothing at all. Pause for a moment right now, and let one specific memory rise, one season you were certain would break you, and notice, gently, that you are here, reading this. Which means it did not. Florence Scovel Shinn would have you look at this evidence honestly, not through the lens of fear that colored it while you lived through it, but through the plain lens of fact afterward. And most of you, looking back honestly, will find the payroll never actually missed you. It only ever felt that way while you were standing too close to the moment to see the whole shape of it. Fear always narrates from too close a distance, and law only ever makes sense from a little further back. This is why looking back so often brings a strange, quiet gratitude, even for the seasons that felt unbearable at the time. Because from here you can finally see what you could not see then. That the check was already in motion the entire time you were certain it had been lost. Fifth, consider how fear itself bends your sense of time, and this is worth naming plainly, because it explains why a punctual payroll can still feel, in the moment, unbearably slow when you are anxious. One single day of waiting can feel like a month. The mind stretches the gap and fills it with worst-case rehearsals, so that by the time provision actually arrives, it feels like it barely made it, like it was cutting it dangerously close, when in truth, it was arriving exactly on schedule, and only fear had stretched the clock. Picture two clocks hanging side by side, both keeping the exact same correct time, and yet one is read by a calm hand and the other by a trembling one. The trembling hand always insists the hour is later than it truly is. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn placed such weight on the inner state rather than the outer date, because two people can wait the exact same 3 days for the exact same check, and one experiences it as an eternity of dread, while the other experiences it as a brief, almost pleasant pause before an appointment they never doubted. The calendar does not change, only the consciousness watching it does, and it is the consciousness, not the calendar, that determines whether those 3 days feel like famine or simply like Tuesday. So much suffering around money is not actually suffering over lack at all. It is suffering over a clock that fear itself has quietly tampered with. Sixth, consider what this means for you starting today. If the law is punctual, if the timing is faithful, even when it looks unfamiliar, if trust, rather than fear, is the actual mechanism keeping the channel wide, if looking honestly at your own past proves the payroll has never truly failed you even once, and if fear itself is the only thing that ever made the wait feel longer than it truly was, then the only reasonable response left available to you is to relax into it, not carelessly, not passively, but with the same quiet, settled confidence you already give the sunrise without a second thought. You do not lie awake at night worrying whether the sun will remember to rise. You have simply never questioned that particular appointment. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say your supply deserves that exact same unquestioned confidence. This is the deepest teaching of this entire key. It is not that you must force the payroll to arrive on time. It is that it was always arriving on time, and your only true work has ever been to stop interrupting that arrival with fear. This is the peak of everything we are exploring here today, and once you have truly received it, everything that follows is simply the gentle art of living from this settled place daily. My payroll is punctual. I trust the hand behind the timing. The eighth key is to keep the account open by letting supply move through you rather than pool inside you. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that money, like water, is healthiest in motion. A river that flows stays clean and full. A pond that only collects and never releases eventually grows stagnant and breeds only stillness. And she would say the same is true of your own relationship to your wages. If you receive only to clutch, only to hoard out of fear, you unknowingly signal to the very source of your supply that the channel is closing rather than opening. But if you receive, and then circulate, spending in gratitude, giving in generosity, paying bills not with dread, but with a quiet thank you for the service already rendered, you keep the entire channel wide and moving. Consider it this way. Your breath does not work by inhaling once and holding that breath forever in some proud attempt to keep it safe. Breath only stays healthy because it is released as freely as it is received, one motion feeding the next. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, your wages were designed to move through you in that exact same rhythm, an inhale of receiving, an exhale of circulating, and any attempt to hold the inhale forever out of fear does not protect you, it only starves you of the next breath waiting to arrive. Think of tithing here not as an obligation imposed from outside, but as a practical demonstration of trust. When you give a portion of what comes to you, cheerfully, without resentment, you are essentially saying to the universe, I trust this river so completely that I can let some of it flow onward without fear, and that trust itself becomes the very thing that keeps the river coming toward you. This is not a transaction where giving earns you a future payment. It is simply proof, spoken in action rather than words, that you have finally stopped believing supply is scarce. Let us walk slowly through an ordinary payday and see this key at work. Imagine a man who receives a small unexpected bonus on a Friday afternoon. The moment it lands, he feels a flicker of relief, followed almost instantly by a tightening. And that tightening begins bargaining with itself. How much of this can I hide away before anyone else needs it? How much can I keep untouched in case the next check never comes? By evening, he has moved it all into a separate account he does not tell his spouse about. And he feels, strangely, not richer, but more anxious than before the bonus arrived at all. Because he has just built a small stagnant pond and placed a fence around it. And a fenced pond, however full, still stagnates. Now consider a woman who receives that exact same bonus, that same Friday afternoon. She feels the same flicker of relief, but instead of tightening, she pauses and breathes, and she quietly divides it 3 ways, without any anxiety at all. A portion set aside in simple gratitude, a portion spent joyfully on something that genuinely delights her, a small dinner out, a gift for her own table, and a portion given freely to someone she knows is in need. No strings, no score kept. And by evening she feels lighter, not because the number in her account is any different from the man's, it is exactly the same number, but because she has just kept a river running instead of building a pond. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say she has understood the true nature of payroll far more deeply than he has, because supply was never meant to be a vault sealed shut against the future. It was always meant to be a channel kept open toward it. Notice something else in that story. The man's fear did not actually protect his future supply any better than the woman's trust did. Both of them will very likely receive their next paycheck regardless. The law does not punish generosity and reward hoarding, but only one of them got to live inside the peace that was always available to both of them while they waited. This is the quiet tragedy of hoarding. It rarely prevents the very lack it fears. It simply adds unnecessary suffering to the waiting. This week, when your own wages arrive, however large or however small, pause before you let the rest simply sit untouched. Let a portion move outward in gratitude first. Pay a bill with a whispered thank you instead of a sigh. Hand something small to someone else without keeping score of it. Spend a little on genuine delight rather than guilt, not recklessly, but freely, and notice how each of these small acts of movement keeps the entire channel wide rather than narrow. Notice too how differently your own body feels after an act of open-handed giving compared to after an act of fearful clutching. One leaves you lighter, the other leaves you quietly bracing. It is not the hoarding that protects your future supply. It is the circulating. It is not the pond that stays clean. It is the river. And once you have learned to let the river move through you, rather than damming it out of old fear, you are finally ready for the simplest and most important habit of all, the daily posture of expectancy that keeps you standing at the riverbank each morning, rather than wandering off in doubt. I receive in gratitude. I release in generosity. The river keeps moving. The ninth key is to expect your next payday with the same quiet, unquestioned confidence you already give the sunrise. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that expectancy is not straining toward a future you doubt. It is resting in a future you already trust. You do not stay up anxiously wondering whether Friday will arrive this week. You simply know it will, because it always has. And she would ask you to hold your supply in that exact same easy confidence, not gripped, not chased, simply expected, the way a child expects breakfast in the morning, without once calculating whether the sun will remember to rise for their sake. Consider the ordinary picture of a father standing on his porch each evening at 5:45, waiting for the yellow bus to round the corner with his daughter aboard. He does not pace. He does not call the school twice to confirm. He does not stand there rehearsing all the ways the bus might fail to arrive. He simply steps outside a few minutes early, because some quiet part of him already knows the bus is coming, and that knowing is not arrogance. It is simply familiarity with a pattern that has never once broken. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, your relationship to your own supply was always meant to feel exactly this ordinary, this unremarkable, this free of drama. Expectancy of this kind is not loud. It does not announce itself with excitement, or grip itself with worry. It simply stands quietly on the porch, at ease, because it has stopped treating arrival as a question and started treating it as an appointment already kept 1,000 times before. Notice, too, that this father's peace was never based on controlling the bus driver, or memorizing the route, or gripping the steering wheel of someone else's vehicle. His peace was based purely on familiarity with a faithful pattern. And this is precisely the peace available to you regarding your own wages, not control over exactly how or when they arrive, but a settled familiarity with the fact that they always have. This final key gathers every other key we have walked through together into one single quiet breath, seeing yourself as already hired, recognizing man as channel rather than source, claiming your wages in the present tense, releasing the old frightened self from a job it was never suited for, showing up daily in small quiet gratitude, refusing false layoff notices, resting in the punctual and faithful timing of law itself, letting supply circulate rather than stagnate, and now, simply, expecting, without straining, without chasing, without a single anxious glance down the road. This key asks only this of you, that you go about your ordinary week, your errands, your emails, your conversations, carrying inside you the same calm certainty you carry about tomorrow's sunrise and about that bus rounding the corner at 5:45, that your payday, in whatever form it arrives, in whatever channel it chooses, is already on its way, because it was never actually gone. I expect my payday the way I expect the sunrise, simply and without fear. Here is the whole picture. It is not that you must earn your place on the payroll. It is that you must recognize the place already given. It is not man who pays you. It is spirit moving through man, as one channel among many. It is not waiting that draws your wages closer. It is claiming them now, in the present tense, as already so. It is not the death of anything true in you when the old frightened self steps down. It is the freeing of the true self, who was always meant to answer in its place. It is not striving daily that builds this consciousness. It is simply showing up, small and faithful, morning after morning. It is not every notice appearances hand you that carries real authority, only the ones signed by fear you agreed to accept. It is not luck governing your timing. It is law, punctual and faithful, even when it wears an unfamiliar disguise. It is not hoarding that protects your future. It is the river kept moving in gratitude. And it is not frantic hoping that finally opens the gate. It is quiet, settled expectancy. And when you look closely, you find these 9 keys were truly never 9 separate ideas at all. They were 9 turns of one single key, the recognition that you are already provided for. And every single turn simply helps that one truth reach further into your daily life. If this teaching has stirred something steady and warm in you today, know there is a place built for those who want to walk this daily, rather than only occasionally. It is called the Overflow Covenant, a small monthly gathering of teachings, affirmations, and daily practices built directly from Florence Scovel Shinn's own principles, designed to keep your consciousness planted firmly on the payroll, rather than wandering back toward old fear. It is $19 a month, fully backed by a simple, no questions asked refund within 30 days. Because this is offered in faith, not in pressure, you will find the link in the description below. And if you feel even a quiet pull toward it, trust that pull. It is often exactly how true supply first announces itself. I am on God's payroll. My wages are already prepared. My word is my wand. And whatever this week brings you, remember gently, the payroll was never once actually late. It was only ever waiting for you to stop bracing at the door and simply walk in and take the seat that already had your name on it, because it never misses a Friday.